As the morning sun reaches its full strength, a massive figure emerges from the Philistine camp and strides down the hillside toward the valley floor. This is Goliath.
Hello there, dear friend. Before we begin this peaceful journey together, I want to know a little about you. How has your day been? Whether it's been filled with joy or challenges, busy moments or quiet pauses, you're exactly where you need to be right now. What time is it where you are in the world? Are you settling in for the night, taking a midday rest, or perhaps greeting the early morning hours? Wherever you are, from the bustling cities of New York to the quiet countryside of England, from the mountains of Colorado to the shores of Australia, you're welcome here in this sacred space. If this story brings you peace, I'd love for you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber, where we gather each week to find rest in timeless tales of faith, hope, and gentle grace. Now, let's begin. Take a deep breath with me. Let your shoulders soften, your jaw relax, and your heart settle into this moment. Whether morning light is streaming through your window, afternoon shadows are dancing on the walls, or midnight quiet surrounds you like a gentle blanket, let us walk together through a story of gentle strength and unseen grace. We're about to enter a time long ago during the days of the judges in ancient Israel. It was a time of chaos and uncertainty, when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But this is not a story of chaos. This is a story of peace, of quiet faithfulness, of love that chooses to remain when it would be easier to leave. This is the story of Ruth, a young woman whose loyalty would echo through generations and whose humble heart would become part of the greatest story ever told. So close your eyes if you wish, breathe slowly, and let us journey together to the ancient land of Moab, where our story begins beside still waters of the soul. In the rolling hills of Moab, where the morning mist clung to the barley fields like a gentle prayer, lived a young woman named Ruth. She had married into a Hebrew family who had come to Moab during a time of famine in their homeland of Bethlehem. Her husband's name was Mahlon, and his mother was Naomi, a woman whose very name meant pleasant, and whose heart had once been full of joy. But sorrow has a way of finding us, even in the most peaceful places. First, Naomi's husband Elimelech died, leaving her alone with her 2 sons in a foreign land. The boys had grown into men and married Moabite women, Ruth and her sister-in-law Orpah. For 10 years they lived together, and Ruth learned to love not just her husband, but his faith, his God, and especially his mother, who had welcomed her with open arms. Then tragedy struck again, swift and merciless. Both Mahlon and his brother Chilion died, leaving 3 widows to face an uncertain world alone. In those days, a woman without a husband or sons had little hope of survival. They were vulnerable, forgotten, with no one to provide for them or protect them. Naomi sat in her small house, looking at the 2 young women who had become like daughters to her. The silence was heavy with grief, but also with decision. She had heard news from Bethlehem that the famine there had ended, that the Lord had visited his people and given them bread. Her heart longed for home, for the familiar hills of Judah, for the place where she had known happiness before sorrow came calling. "My daughters," she said softly, her voice worn thin by weeping, "I must return to my people. But you are young. You have your whole lives ahead of you. Go back to your mothers' houses. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." She kissed them both, and they wept together. How can you say goodbye to someone who has been your family, your comfort, your companion through the darkest days? Orpah, after much tears and embracing, finally agreed to return to her people and her gods. It was the practical choice, the safe choice, the choice that made sense to everyone around them. But Ruth clung to Naomi with a determination that surprised them all. When Naomi urged her again to follow her sister-in-law, Ruth spoke words that would echo through history, words that came from the deepest place in her heart. "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." There was something in Ruth's voice that told Naomi this was not a decision made in the heat of emotion, but a choice carved in stone, written in the very fibre of her being. This young Moabite woman was choosing love over security, faithfulness over comfort, an unknown future over a predictable past. And so they began the long journey from Moab to Bethlehem, two women with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the strength of their love for each other. They walked through valleys where wildflowers nodded in the breeze, past streams that sang ancient songs, under skies that seemed to stretch endlessly toward hope. As they travelled, Ruth would gather berries and herbs along the way, always making sure Naomi had enough to eat. She would find the softest spot for them to rest each night, would share her cloak when the desert air grew cold. She had chosen this path, and she would walk it with grace and dignity, one step at a time. The journey took many days, and with each step toward Bethlehem, Ruth was walking further from everything she had ever known. She was leaving behind the gods of her childhood, the customs of her people, the language of her birth. She was choosing to become a stranger in a strange land, not because she had to, but because love had made the choice for her. When they finally crested the hill that overlooked Bethlehem, the city spread before them like a handful of pearls scattered on brown velvet. The sun was setting, painting the stone houses in shades of gold and amber. Smoke rose from evening fires, and the sound of children playing drifted up to them on the evening breeze. "Look," Naomi whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There it is, home." But as they descended into the city, the women who had known Naomi in her happier days barely recognized her. "Is this Naomi?" they asked each other, seeing how sorrow had aged her, how loss had bent her shoulders and silvered her hair. "Do not call me Naomi," she told them, her voice steady but sad. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home empty." But Ruth, standing quietly beside her, knew that Naomi was not truly empty. She had brought with her the love of this young woman, who had chosen to forsake all for the sake of faithfulness. And though neither of them knew it yet, they had arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest, when the fields were golden and ready, when provision was about to unfold in ways they could never have imagined. The story was just beginning, and the God who notices every sparrow that falls, who counts every tear that is shed, who remembers every act of kindness, was already preparing the next chapter of their lives. The morning air in Bethlehem was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of ripening grain and the promise of a new day. Ruth woke early, as she always did, listening to the gentle rhythm of Naomi's breathing beside her. They had found a small place to stay, but their provisions were nearly gone, and Ruth knew that something had to be done. She'd heard about the law of gleaning, a beautiful provision that the God of Israel had made for the poor and the stranger. After the reapers went through the fields harvesting the grain, the needy could follow behind and gather what was left. It was honest work, humble work, but it was work that could keep them alive. "Let me go to the fields," Ruth said gently to Naomi, "and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favour." Naomi nodded, understanding the necessity but also the risk. Ruth was young and beautiful, and the fields could be dangerous places for a woman alone. But there was something in Ruth's quiet determination that spoke of inner strength, of a spirit that could not be easily broken. And so Ruth set out in the early morning light, joining the other gleaners who moved like shadows behind the harvest workers. She had wrapped her head modestly and carried a small basket, ready to spend the day bent over in the sun, gathering grain kernel by kernel. As it happened, she came to the field that belonged to Boaz, a man of great wealth and standing in Bethlehem. But more than that, though Ruth did not know it yet, Boaz was a relative of Naomi's late husband, a kinsman who had the right and responsibility to help family members in need. The phrase, "as it happened," seems simple enough, but sometimes the most profound movements of providence come disguised as coincidence. Ruth's feet carried her to that particular field not by accident, but by the gentle guidance of a God who was weaving a story larger than she could imagine. Boaz arrived at his field that morning, as was his custom, to greet his workers and oversee the harvest. He was a man in his middle years, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. When he saw his reapers, he called out, "The Lord be with you," and they responded, "The Lord bless you." It was more than a greeting. It was a glimpse into the heart of a man who knew that all good things come from above. But his attention was caught by a young woman he had never seen before, working quietly at the edge of his field. She moved with grace and dignity, even in the humbling work of gleaning. There was something about her that drew his eye, not just her beauty, but the way she carried herself with quiet strength. "Whose young woman is this?" he asked his foreman. "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab," the foreman replied. "She asked permission to glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers, and she has been working steadily from early morning until now with only a brief rest." Boaz watched her for a moment longer, seeing how she worked without complaining, how she was careful not to take more than was rightfully hers, how she paused to help an elderly gleaner who had dropped her grain. His heart was moved by her diligence and her kindness. He approached her quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Listen, my daughter," he said gently. "Do not go to glean in another field, and do not leave this one. Stay close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. I have charged the young men not to touch you, and when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Ruth was so surprised by his kindness that she fell on her face and bowed to the ground. "Why have I found favour in your sight," she asked, "that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz had already heard the story of her loyalty to Naomi, how she had left her own people to care for her mother-in-law. "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me," he said, his voice warm with admiration. "How you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth's eyes filled with tears at his words. She had not expected such kindness from a stranger, such recognition of her small acts of faithfulness. "You have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant," she said softly, "though I am not one of your servants." As the day wore on, Boaz continued to watch over her. At mealtime he invited her to eat with his workers, to dip her bread in the wine and share in the meal. He even made sure she had roasted grain to take home to Naomi. When she returned to her gleaning, he quietly instructed his workers to leave extra grain for her to find, to make her work easier and more fruitful. The sun was beginning to set when Ruth finally made her way home, her basket heavy with grain. She had gathered an ephah of barley, enough to feed herself and Naomi for many days. But more than that, she carried with her the memory of unexpected kindness, of a man who had seen beyond her status as a foreigner and a widow to recognize the faithfulness of her heart. When she showed Naomi all that she'd gathered and told her about the kindness of Boaz, Naomi's eyes brightened for the first time in months. "Blessed be he by the Lord," she said, "whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Ruth continued to glean in the fields of Boaz throughout the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, always welcomed, always protected, always provided for. She would come home each evening with grain and with stories of the kindness she had experienced. And slowly, so slowly that neither of them noticed it happening, hope began to take root in their hearts once again. Little did they know that this was only the beginning of a story that would change not just their lives, but the course of history itself. For the God who sees every act of kindness, who remembers every sacrifice made in love, was already preparing the next chapter of their beautiful story. The harvest season was drawing to a close, and the grain had been gathered from the fields and brought to the threshing floor. It was a time of celebration and completion, when the hard work of the harvest gave way to the satisfaction of provision secured. The air was filled with the sound of winnowing, as the grain was separated from the chaff in the evening breeze. Naomi had been watching the growing affection between Ruth and Boaz with the wisdom of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the hand of God in everyday circumstances. She had seen how Boaz's eyes followed Ruth, how he spoke to her with special gentleness, how he made sure she was always provided for and protected. And she had seen how Ruth, despite her natural reserve, had begun to smile more often, how she spoke Boaz's name with a special warmth. One evening, as they sat together in their small dwelling, Naomi took Ruth's hands in hers. "My daughter," she said softly, "should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor." Ruth listened carefully as Naomi explained the custom of the kinsman redeemer, how a close relative had the right and responsibility to marry a widow to preserve the family line and inheritance. It was not just about marriage, but about redemption, about restoring what had been lost, about ensuring that the names of the dead were not forgotten. "Wash therefore and anoint yourself," Naomi continued, "and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." It was a bold plan, one that required great courage and faith. Ruth would be placing herself in a vulnerable position, trusting in the character of a man she had come to respect and admire. But she had learned to trust Naomi's wisdom, and more than that, she had learned to trust the God who had been guiding her steps from the very beginning. "All that you say I will do," Ruth replied simply. As the sun set and the first stars appeared in the clear night sky, Ruth prepared herself carefully. She bathed and anointed herself with fragrant oil, then put on her best garment. But this was not about seduction or manipulation. This was about approaching a good man with dignity and respect, trusting in his honour and in the customs that governed their society. The threshing floor was a place of hard work and celebration, where the grain was separated from the chaff and the harvest was completed. By the time Ruth arrived, the work was done, and the men had eaten and drunk and told stories under the stars. The atmosphere was one of contentment and satisfaction, of work well done and provision secured. Ruth waited in the shadows, watching as Boaz finished his meal and settled down to sleep beside the heap of grain. It was his responsibility to guard the grain through the night, to ensure that nothing was stolen or damaged. The night was warm and peaceful, filled with the sounds of crickets and the gentle rustle of the evening breeze. When all was quiet and Boaz was sleeping peacefully, Ruth approached with silent steps. Her heart was beating fast, but her movements were sure and deliberate. She gently uncovered his feet and lay down, then waited in the darkness for him to wake. It was midnight when Boaz stirred, suddenly aware of someone at his feet. He was startled but not afraid, turning carefully to see who was there. In the dim starlight he could make out the form of a woman, and he recognized her immediately. "Who are you?" he asked softly. "I am Ruth, your servant," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Spread your wing over your servant, for you are a redeemer." It was a beautiful way of asking for his protection and provision, using the imagery of a bird sheltering her young under her wing. She was asking him to fulfill the role of kinsman redeemer, to marry her and restore the inheritance of her late husband. Boaz was deeply moved by her words, by the trust she had placed in him, by the way she had approached him with such dignity and grace. "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter," he said warmly. "You have made this last kindness greater than the first in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." He was older than Ruth, a man of substance and position, and he was amazed that she would choose him over the many young men who would have been eager to marry such a beautiful and virtuous woman. Her choice spoke of wisdom and character, of a heart that valued kindness and faithfulness over youth and passion. "And now, my daughter, do not fear," he continued. "I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. and now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." There was another relative who had the first right of redemption, and Boaz was too honourable to proceed without giving that man the opportunity to fulfil his duty. "Remain tonight," he said gently, "and in the morning if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." Ruth lay down again at his feet, comforted by his words and his promise. She had taken a great risk in coming to him, but she had found in Boaz a man of integrity and honour, someone who would do what was right even when it was difficult. When the morning came, before anyone else was stirring, Boaz quietly measured out 6 measures of barley and helped Ruth arrange it in her cloak. "Do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed," he said with a smile. Then he sent her on her way before anyone could see her and misunderstand her presence there. Ruth returned home with her heart full of hope and her arms full of grain. When Naomi saw her coming, she knew immediately that something significant had happened. "How did you fare, my daughter?" she asked eagerly. Ruth told her everything that had happened, every word that had been spoken, every kindness that had been shown. When she finished, Naomi smiled with satisfaction. "Wait, my daughter," she said, "until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest but will settle the matter today." And so they waited, 2 women who had learned that sometimes the greatest acts of faith happen in the quiet moments, when we trust in the goodness of others and in the providence of God. The next chapter of their story was about to unfold, and with it the fulfillment of promises they had hardly dared to hope for. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the stones of Bethlehem when Boaz made his way to the city gate. This was where the elders gathered, where business was conducted, where legal matters were settled according to the ancient customs of Israel. His heart was full of purpose as he took his seat and waited for the other Redeemer to pass by. He didn't have to wait long. Soon he saw the man approaching, and Boaz called out to him by name. "Come over, friend, and sit down here." The man, curious about what business Boaz might have with him, came and sat down. Then Boaz gathered 10 of the city elders to serve as witnesses, for what he was about to do would affect not just 2 people, but entire family lines and inheritances. "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab," Boaz began, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, but if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." The other man considered this carefully. A piece of land was valuable, an investment that could bring profit and increase his holdings. "I will redeem it," he said confidently. But Boaz was not finished. "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Suddenly the proposition became more complicated. To marry Ruth would mean that any children born to them would be considered the heirs of her first husband, not his own. The land would eventually pass to them, not to his existing family line. What had seemed like a good business deal now became a sacrifice that would cost him more than he was willing to pay. "I cannot redeem it for myself," he said, backing away from the commitment, "lest I impair my own inheritance. You take my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it." It was exactly what Boaz had hoped to hear. According to the custom of the time, the man removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz as a sign that he was transferring his right of redemption. The sandal was a symbol of walking in someone else's place, of taking on their responsibilities and privileges. Boaz accepted the sandal and turned to address the elders and all the people who had gathered to witness this transaction. "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." The crowd erupted in celebration and blessing. "We are witnesses," they called out joyfully. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." It was a beautiful blessing, invoking the names of the great matriarchs of Israel and expressing the hope that Ruth would become equally honoured in the history of God's people, and how prophetic those words would prove to be. Meanwhile, Ruth and Naomi had been waiting at home, their hearts full of anticipation and hope. When the messenger came running to tell them what had happened at the gate, they could hardly believe their ears. The legal proceedings had gone exactly as they had hoped. Boaz had redeemed not just the land, but Ruth herself, and they were to be married. The wedding was a joyous occasion, celebrated by the entire community. Ruth, the young Moabite woman who had arrived in Bethlehem as a poor widow, was now the honoured wife of one of the most respected men in the city. But more than that, she had found in Boaz a man who valued her faithfulness, who cherished her loyalty, who would love and protect her for the rest of their days. As the seasons passed, Ruth and Boaz settled into a life of contentment and purpose. Boaz was a generous provider, and Ruth was a wise and gentle wife. Naomi, no longer bitter but filled with joy, lived with them and was cared for in her old age. The house that had once echoed with sorrow now rang with laughter and love. And then came the greatest blessing of all. Ruth conceived and bore a son, a healthy, beautiful child who would be raised in the love and fear of the Lord. The women of the neighbourhood came to congratulate Naomi, saying, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." They named the child Obed, which means servant or worshipper, and Naomi took him on her lap and became his nurse. The child brought healing to her broken heart, restoration to her empty life, and joy to her golden years. But the story doesn't end there. Little Obed grew up to become the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, the great king of Israel, and through David's line would come the Messiah, the Saviour of the world. Ruth, the foreign woman who had chosen loyalty over security, faith over fear, had become part of the most important family tree in all of human history. In the genealogy of Jesus Christ, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, we find these words: Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. A Moabite woman's name is written forever in the lineage of the Son of God, a testament to the truth that God's grace knows no boundaries, that his love extends to all who seek refuge under his wings. Ruth's story teaches us that faithfulness in small things leads to blessing in great things, that loyalty and love are never wasted, that God can take our deepest sorrows and weave them into his greatest joys. She reminds us that sometimes the most profound acts of faith happen not in grand gestures, but in quiet decisions to remain faithful, to keep loving, to keep trusting, even when we cannot see the end of the story. As we come to the end of Ruth's story, let us pause beside these still waters and reflect on the gentle truths that flow through this ancient tale. Like a quiet stream that shapes the landscape over time, Ruth's life teaches us lessons that can transform our own journey of faith. Ruth's story shows us the profound power of remaining faithful, even in seasons of pain and uncertainty. When Naomi urged her to return to her people and her gods, Ruth could have chosen the easier path, the path that made sense to everyone around her. Instead, she chose love. She chose to remain loyal to a woman who had shown her kindness, to a faith that had captured her heart, to a God she was still learning to trust. Her famous words, "Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God," were not spoken in a moment of emotional impulse, but from a deep well of commitment that had been growing in her heart over years of walking with Naomi. In our own lives, we face moments when loyalty is tested, when it would be easier to walk away from relationships, commitments, or callings that have become difficult. Ruth's example reminds us that some of the most beautiful chapters of our lives are written in the ink of faithful love, even when that love costs us something precious. Have you ever chosen love when it would have been easier to walk away? Perhaps you stayed with a friend through a difficult season, remained committed to a calling when it became challenging, or continued to love someone even when they couldn't love you back in the same way. These quiet acts of loyalty are never wasted. They shape us into people of depth and character, and they often open doors to blessings we never could have imagined. One of the most beautiful aspects of Ruth's story is how rarely God's name is mentioned, yet his presence is evident in every chapter. The phrase, "as it happened," appears when Ruth comes to Boaz's field, but we understand that this was no accident. It was divine providence working through ordinary circumstances to bring about extraordinary results. God's guidance in Ruth's life came not through burning bushes or angelic visitations, but through the kindness of a stranger, the wisdom of a mother-in-law, and the legal proceedings at a city gate. He worked through the natural rhythms of harvest and gleaning, through cultural customs and family relationships, through the everyday decisions of people who were simply trying to do what was right. This reminds us that God's hand is often most visible in hindsight, in the moments when we look back and see how perfectly things came together, how doors opened at just the right time, how people entered our lives precisely when we needed them most. The God who numbers our days and knows our needs is constantly at work in the ordinary moments of our lives, weaving together circumstances and relationships for our good and his glory. Can you see moments in your own life where something just happened at the perfect time? Perhaps you met a lifelong friend in an unexpected place, discovered an opportunity through a chance conversation, or found help arriving just when you needed it most. These are not coincidences, but glimpses of a loving God who is intimately involved in the details of our lives. Ruth's story is ultimately about transformation, about how God can take our deepest losses and weave them into his greatest purposes. She began as a young widow in a foreign land, with no prospects and no security. She was an outsider, a foreigner, someone who by all human standards had little to offer the grand story of God's people. Yet her simple acts of faithfulness, her quiet loyalty, her willingness to work humbly in the fields, positioned her to become part of the royal lineage of David and ultimately of Jesus Christ. Her name is recorded forever in the genealogy of the Messiah, a testament to the truth that no one is too small, too foreign, or too broken to be used by God for his purposes. Ruth's transformation from widow to wife, from foreigner to family member, from poverty to provision, reminds us that our current circumstances do not define our future possibilities. The God who saw potential in a Moabite gleaner sees potential in each of us, regardless of our background, our mistakes, or our limitations. No matter where you come from, no matter what losses you have experienced, no matter how ordinary your life may seem, your story can become part of something bigger. Your faithfulness in small things, your acts of love and loyalty, your willingness to trust God even when you cannot see the whole picture. These are the threads that God uses to weave his magnificent tapestry of grace. Perhaps you are in a season of loss right now, wondering if your pain has any purpose, if your faithfulness matters, if your small acts of love make any difference. Ruth's story whispers hope into those questions. It reminds us that God wastes nothing, that he can bring beauty from ashes, that he specializes in writing stories of redemption and restoration. The title of Ruth's story, Beside Still Waters, comes from the 23rd Psalm, where David writes about the Good Shepherd, who leads his sheep beside still waters and restores their souls. Ruth's life exemplifies this truth. In the midst of chaos and uncertainty, she found peace in her commitment to love and faithfulness. In the midst of loss and grief, she discovered that God's provision was always enough for each day. Her story teaches us that peace is not the absence of problems, but the presence of God in our problems. It's not found in perfect circumstances, but in perfect trust. Ruth faced real challenges, real losses, real fears. but she faced them with a spirit of quiet faith and humble obedience. The still waters of God's peace are available to us in every season of life. They flow not from our circumstances, but from our relationship with the one who is the source of all peace. When we, like Ruth, choose to trust in God's goodness, even when we cannot see his plan, when we choose to remain faithful even when the path is unclear, we find ourselves beside still waters where our souls can be restored. As you drift toward rest tonight, may you carry with you the gentle strength of Ruth's example. May you know that even in quiet places, even in fields of sorrow, even in long roads and sleepless nights, grace is never far away. The God who saw Ruth's faithfulness, who provided for her needs, who wove her story into his greater plan, is the same God who sees you tonight. Your acts of loyalty may seem small, but they matter. Your faithfulness in ordinary moments is building something beautiful. Your willingness to trust when you cannot see the whole picture is positioning you for blessings you cannot yet imagine. Rest now in the peace that comes from knowing you are held by a love that will never let you go, guided by a wisdom that sees the end from the beginning, and called into a story that is bigger and more beautiful than you can possibly imagine. May you sleep beside still waters, where your soul can be restored, your strength can be renewed, and your hope can be refreshed for whatever tomorrow may bring. The God who led Ruth from loss to legacy, from sorrow to joy, from emptiness to fullness is leading you too, and his plans for you are good. Sweet dreams, dear friend. May you wake tomorrow with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are deeply loved, perfectly guided, and part of a story that extends far beyond what you can see. Like Ruth, who could never have imagined that her simple decision to stay loyal to Naomi would lead to her becoming the great-grandmother of King David, you too are part of a tapestry being woven by hands far wiser than your own. Your faithfulness today, your love tomorrow, your trust in the unseen God who walks beside you, these are the threads that he is using to create something beautiful, something lasting, something that will echo through generations. Rest now in the shadow of his wings, knowing that you are safe, you are seen, and you are more precious than you know. The same God who led Ruth beside still waters is leading you too, and his love will never fail. Amen.
Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin our journey together into this timeless story of faith and courage, I want to take a moment to connect with you, wherever you are in the world tonight. How has your day been? Perhaps you're settling in as the evening draws near, or maybe you're starting your morning with this gentle retelling. Whether it's midnight where you are, or the sun is just beginning to rise, know that you're exactly where you need to be. I'm curious about where this story is finding you tonight. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in North America? Perhaps watching the stars appear through your window? Or maybe you're in Europe, beginning a peaceful morning with this tale. Perhaps you're in Asia, Africa, Australia, or anywhere else across our beautiful world. Wherever you are, you're part of our global Sacred Slumber family, and we're so grateful to have you here. If this is your first time joining us, or if you've been with us before, we invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber, where we bring you gentle Bible stories and peaceful reflections designed to encourage your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in together as we journey to ancient Israel, to a valley where faith would triumph over fear, and where a young shepherd boy would show the world that with God all things are possible. The golden sun rises slowly over the valley of Elah, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. The air is crisp with morning dew, and a gentle breeze carries the scent of wild flowers that dot the hillsides. This valley, nestled between rolling hills covered with olive trees and scattered stones, would soon become the stage for one of history's most remarkable displays of faith. On the eastern ridge, the armies of Israel have made their camp. Hundreds of tents stretch across the hillside, their fabric fluttering softly in the morning breeze. Smoke rises from cooking fires where soldiers prepare their simple breakfast of bread and olives. The men move quietly, their faces etched with concern, their eyes constantly drawn to the valley below and the opposite hill. For across the valley, on the western ridge, stands another camp. The Philistines have pitched their tents there, their bronze weapons glinting in the early light. These are seasoned warriors, confident in their strength, their numbers, and their champion who has struck terror into the hearts of Israel's army for 40 long days. Between these two armies lies the valley itself, a stretch of land that seems to hold its breath in anticipation. The grass grows green here, watered by a small brook that winds its way through the centre of the valley, its waters singing softly over smooth stones. It's a peaceful place, this valley, seemingly too beautiful for the conflict that's about to unfold. But it's here, in this quiet valley, that we find a young man who will change everything. His name is David, and he's not a soldier at all. He's a shepherd from the small town of Bethlehem, the youngest of 8 brothers. While his older brothers serve in King Saul's army, David tends his father's sheep on the hillsides near his home. David has olive skin bronzed by countless hours under the Palestinian sun, and eyes that sparkle with life, an unwavering trust in the God of Israel. His hands, though young, are strong from years of guiding sheep, playing his harp and practicing with his simple shepherd's sling. He's small in stature compared to the warriors in both camps, but there's something different about David, something that sets him apart. It's not his size or his strength, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that the God who created the heavens and earth is also the God who watches over him as he watches over his sheep. As the sun climbs higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, a stirring begins in both camps. The day's challenge is about to begin, and David, though he doesn't know it yet, is about to step into a moment that will echo through eternity. For 39 days, the same terrifying scene has played out in the valley of Elah. As the morning sun reaches its full strength, a massive figure emerges from the Philistine camp and strides down the hillside toward the valley floor. This is Goliath of Gath, and he is a sight that would make even the bravest heart tremble. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, Goliath is a giant among men. His frame is muscular and imposing, built like a fortress of flesh and bone. His bronze helmet catches the sunlight, and his scale armour gleams like the surface of a deep, dark sea. Each scale of his armour has been carefully crafted, overlapping like fish scales, to create an almost impenetrable defence. The armour alone weighs more than many men could carry, yet Goliath wears it as easily as another man might wear a simple tunic. In his massive hand he carries a spear, whose iron point is as large as a weaver's rod, and whose shaft is thick as a small tree. On his back hangs a bronze sword, and his legs are protected by bronze greaves that shine like mirrors. Walking before him is his armour-bearer, a man who would be considered large in any other company, but appears almost childlike next to his champion. As Goliath reaches the centre of the valley, near the gently flowing brook, he stops and turns to face the Israelite camp on the eastern hill. Then, in a voice that booms across the valley like thunder, he issues his daily challenge. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" His voice echoes off the hillsides, causing birds to take flight from the olive trees. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." He pauses, letting his words sink in, and then continues with a sneer that the Israelite soldiers can hear even from their distant positions. "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." The challenge hangs in the morning air like a dark cloud. On the hillside, King Saul's army shifts nervously. These are not cowards, these soldiers of Israel. They are men who have fought battles and defended their homeland with courage. But Goliath represents something beyond normal warfare. He is not just a man. He seems like a force of nature, an unstoppable mountain of bronze and flesh. Among the Israelite ranks are 3 brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, sons of Jesse from Bethlehem. They stand with their fellow soldiers, feeling the same chill of fear that grips every man present. They've heard stories of giants in the land, descendants of the Anakim, who struck terror in the hearts of their forefathers. But seeing Goliath is different from hearing stories. His very presence seems to drain the courage from their hearts. King Saul himself, who stands head and shoulders above most men, feels small in comparison to this Philistine champion. The king who once stood fearlessly against Israel's enemies now finds himself at a loss. He has offered great rewards to any man who will face Goliath, riches beyond measure, his own daughter in marriage, and exemption from taxes for the victor's family. But for 39 days, no man has stepped forward. As Goliath's voice fades across the valley, an oppressive silence settles over both camps. The Philistines are confident, almost jovial in their certainty. Their champion is invincible, and they know it. Soon all of Israel will bow before their might. But in the Israelite camp, fear has taken root like a poisonous vine. With each passing day, with each repeated challenge, that fear grows stronger. The soldiers begin to whisper among themselves. Some wonder if they should retreat. Others question whether God has abandoned them. The shadow of one man, one giant, is darkening the faith of an entire nation. Yet God, who sees all things, who knows the end from the beginning, has already prepared an answer to this seemingly impossible challenge. And that answer is not a mighty warrior or a skilled general. It's a young shepherd boy who at this very moment is walking the dusty roads that lead to the valley of Elah, carrying nothing more threatening than food for his brothers and cheese for their commander. As the day progresses and Goliath returns to his camp with another unchallenged victory, the stage is being set for an encounter that will demonstrate once and for all that the battle belongs not to the strong, but to the Lord. The morning sun is climbing higher when David crests the hill overlooking the valley of Elah. He's been walking since before dawn, carrying a heavy pack filled with roasted grain and 10 loaves of fresh bread for his brothers and 10 cuts of cheese for their unit commander. His father Jesse, concerned about his sons serving in King Saul's army, has sent David to check on them and bring them provisions. As David approaches the Israelite camp, he can hear the familiar sounds of an army preparing for battle. The clank of bronze armour, the scraping of swords being sharpened, and the low murmur of soldiers' voices. But there's something else in the air, something David can sense even before he understands it. There's a tension here, a fear that seems to hang over the camp like morning fog. David makes his way through the camp, asking for directions to find his brothers. The soldiers he passes look weary, their faces drawn with anxiety. Some pace nervously, others sit quietly, staring toward the valley. This is not what David expected to find. Where is the courage of Israel's army? Where is the confidence that should come from serving the God who delivered them from Egypt and gave them this promised land? Finally, David spots his brothers among their unit, and his face brightens with joy. He hurries toward them, his pack bouncing on his shoulders, but as he greets Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, he notices that they too carry the same haunted expression as the other soldiers. "Father sent provisions," David says warmly, beginning to unpack the food. "He's been worried about you and wanted to make sure you have enough to eat." But before his brothers can respond fully to his greeting, a sound begins to build from across the valley. It starts as a low rumble and grows into the unmistakable boom of Goliath's voice. David stops unpacking and turns toward the valley, his eyes widening as he sees the massive figure striding down the hillside. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David asks, his voice filled not with fear, but with indignation. The words come naturally to him, spoken with the simple faith of someone who knows God personally, intimately, like a shepherd knows his flock. The soldiers around David stare at him in amazement. Some even step back, as if his words might bring Goliath's wrath down upon them. But David isn't speaking recklessly. He's speaking from a heart that has experienced God's faithfulness. In the quiet places, in the fields where he tends sheep, under the stars where he plays his harp and sings psalms to the God who made them. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? David continues, his voice carrying a confidence that seems foreign in this camp of frightened warriors. The soldiers explain about King Saul's promised rewards, but David barely seems to hear them. His focus is not on gold or marriage or tax exemption. His concern is for the honour of God and the reputation of God's people. How can this Philistine be allowed to mock the armies of the living God? How can Israel's soldiers allow this blasphemy to continue day after day? Word of David's questions and his bold words quickly spreads through the camp. Some soldiers are amazed by his courage. Others think he's simply too young to understand the danger. But when the news reaches Eliab, David's oldest brother, he responds with anger and embarrassment. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab demands, his face flushed with frustration. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are, and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Eliab's harsh words reveal the tension that can exist even in families when faith and fear collide. Perhaps Eliab is embarrassed that his youngest brother shows more courage than he and his fellow soldiers have demonstrated. Perhaps he's genuinely concerned for David's safety. But David responds with gentle humility. "Now what have I done?" David asks calmly. "Can't I even speak?" He doesn't argue with his brother or defend himself harshly. Instead, he simply continues asking his questions, seeking to understand why no one has stepped forward to defend God's honour. Eventually, word of David's bold questions reaches King Saul himself. The king, desperate for any glimmer of hope, sends for this young man who speaks so fearlessly about facing the Philistine giant. When David is brought before him, Saul sees nothing impressive about this youth. David is small, young, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who works outdoors. He carries no sword, no armour, nothing that would mark him as a warrior. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," David says to the king with quiet confidence. "Your servant will go and fight him." King Saul looks at David in disbelief. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him," he says, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility and fear. "You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David's response comes from a wellspring of faith that has been tested and proven in the wilderness places where no one was watching. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep," David begins, his voice steady and sure. "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." David pauses, and in that pause the tent seems to fill with the presence of something greater than human courage. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Here is the key to David's confidence. It's not based on his own strength or skill. It's not rooted in pride or youthful foolishness. David's courage comes from his personal experience of God's faithfulness. In the quiet places when no one was watching except God, David learned to trust. When wild beasts threatened his father's sheep, David didn't run. He stood and fought, not in his own strength, but trusting in the God who had called him to be a shepherd. King Saul, moved by David's faith, and perhaps remembering his own younger days when he trusted God more completely, finally gives his consent. "Go," he says, "and the Lord be with you." Wanting to give David every possible advantage, Saul dresses him in his own tunic and puts a bronze helmet on his head and a coat of armour on his body. He gives David his own sword to carry, but when David tries to walk in all this military gear, he finds he can hardly move. "I cannot go in these," David says to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he takes off the armour, removes the helmet, and sets aside the sword. He will not try to become something he's not, or fight in a way that's foreign to him. David will face Goliath as himself, a shepherd boy who trusts in the living God. Instead, David picks up his staff, the simple wooden rod that has been his companion through countless days in the fields. He goes to the brook that runs through the valley and carefully selects 5 smooth stones worn perfectly round by the flowing water. He places these in his shepherd's bag and takes his sling in his hand. As David walks toward the valley, he carries with him something more powerful than any bronze armour or iron sword. He carries the confidence that comes from knowing God personally, from experiencing his faithfulness in the quiet places of life. And he carries the understanding that this battle is not really between David and Goliath at all. This is a battle between the God of Israel and the false gods of the Philistines, between truth and blasphemy, between faith and fear. The young shepherd is ready to face the giant, not because he is strong, but because he knows the one who is stronger than any earthly power. The afternoon sun hangs bright and warm over the valley of Elah as 2 figures begin their approach toward each other across the grassy floor of the valley. The contrast between them could not be more dramatic, and yet it's precisely in this contrast that God's glory will be revealed. From the western hill, Goliath begins his descent, his bronze armour catching and reflecting the sunlight like a beacon. Each step he takes shakes the ground slightly, and the sound of his armour clanking echoes across the valley. He moves with the confidence of someone who has never known defeat, never felt the sting of uncertainty. His armour-bearer walks before him, carrying the massive shield that will protect the giant from any arrows that might be fired from the Israelite lines. From the eastern hill, David begins his own journey down into the valley. He walks with a steady, purposeful gait, his simple shepherd's clothing a stark contrast to the military spectacle approaching from the other side. In one hand he carries his staff, worn smooth by years of use. In the other, he holds his sling, a simple leather pouch attached to 2 cords, the kind of weapon that shepherds have used for generations to protect their flocks from predators. Behind David on the hillside, the entire Israelite army watches in stunned silence. Thousands of seasoned warriors stand motionless, their eyes fixed on the small figure walking steadily towards certain death. Some of them pray silently, asking God to protect this brave boy. Others shake their heads in disbelief at what they perceive as pointless sacrifice. King Saul watches from his position among his officers, his heart heavy with the responsibility for sending a youth to face a giant. On the opposite hill, the Philistine army watches with amusement and anticipation. They point at David and laugh among themselves, joking about how quickly their champion will dispatch this boy. Some of them are already making plans for the victory celebration they'll hold after Israel surrenders, as surely they must, after witnessing their champion's inevitable defeat. But as David walks down the hillside, his heart is neither fearful nor boastful. Instead, it's filled with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing he is not walking into this valley alone. The same God who helped him rescue sheep from the mouths of lions and bears is with him now. The same God who has been his shepherd will be his strength. As the two figures draw closer together, in the centre of the valley, near the gently flowing brook, Goliath gets his first clear look at his opponent. What he sees fills him with contempt and rage. This is not a warrior, this is just a boy, ruddy and handsome, carrying a shepherd's simple tools instead of weapons of war. "Am I a dog," Goliath roars, his voice booming across the valley, "that you come at me with sticks?" His anger at what he perceives as an insult burns hot. He expected Israel to send their greatest warrior, someone worthy of his attention. Instead, they've sent a child. Goliath continues his verbal assault, his voice carrying clearly to both armies. "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." The threat hangs in the air like the cry of a predator, and even some of the Philistine soldiers feel a chill at the cruelty in their champion's voice. But David, standing in the valley with the afternoon sun behind him, casting his shadow long across the grass, remains unshaken. When he speaks, his voice carries clearly across the valley, and every word is heard by both armies. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David calls out, his young voice strong and clear. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The words echo across the valley like a bell ringing, clear and pure and full of power. David continues, and as he speaks, something changes in the atmosphere of the valley. The mocking laughter from the Philistine hill begins to fade. On the Israelite side, soldiers lean forward, straining to hear every word. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." David's words ring with prophetic power and absolute certainty. He's not boasting in his own strength or skill. Instead, he's making a declaration of faith, a public testimony to the power and faithfulness of the God of Israel. This battle, David understands, is not ultimately about military might or human courage. It's about the honour of God and the revelation of his power to both Israel and the surrounding nations. Goliath, enraged by what he sees as blasphemous arrogance from a mere boy, begins moving quickly toward David, his massive frame covering the ground with surprising speed. His armour clanks and his weapons gleam as he bears down on his small opponent like an avalanche of bronze and iron. But David doesn't flee. Instead, he runs toward Goliath, closing the distance between them with swift, determined steps. As he runs, he reaches into his shepherd's bag and takes out one of the smooth stones he selected from the brook. With practiced ease, born of countless hours protecting sheep, he places the stone in his sling. The sling is not a child's toy, though it may appear simple. In the hands of a skilled shepherd, it's a precision weapon capable of tremendous force. David has used his sling to drive off wolves and bears, to guide wandering sheep, and to strike targets with accuracy at considerable distances. Now as he runs toward Goliath, all those years of practice culminate in this single, crucial moment. With fluid motion, perfected through countless repetitions, David begins to swing the sling around his head, building momentum. The leather pouch whispers through the air as it spins, faster and faster. Goliath, seeing David's movement, may have raised his shield, or adjusted his position, but his great size, which has always been his advantage, now works against him. He cannot change direction quickly, cannot dodge with the agility of a smaller man. At the perfect moment, when the geometry of angle and distance and momentum align exactly right, David releases one of the cords. The stone flies from the sling like an arrow, swift and straight and true, guided by skill and powered by faith. The stone strikes Goliath in the centre of his forehead, at the one spot where his bronze helmet doesn't protect him, with tremendous force. The sound of impact echoes across the valley like the crack of thunder. For a moment time seems suspended. The giant warrior, seemingly invincible in his bronze armour, stands motionless. Then, like a great tree falling in the forest, Goliath topples forward and crashes to the ground. The earth trembles under the impact of his massive frame. His weapons clatter beside him, his armour scrapes against the stones, and then there is silence. David runs to where Goliath lies and stands over the fallen giant. Finding no sword of his own, David draws Goliath's own massive sword from its sheath, and with effort befitting his size, uses it to cut off the giant's head, fulfilling his prophecy exactly as he had spoken it. Then David lifts Goliath's head high above his own, and his voice rings out across the valley one more time, "The battle is the Lord's." The silence that follows is profound and complete, broken only by the gentle sound of the brook flowing peacefully through the valley, washing the smooth stones that remain in David's shepherd's bag. The sight of their fallen champion creates an immediate and dramatic transformation in both armies. On the Philistine hillside, the confident laughter and casual conversation die away instantly, replaced by stunned silence and then growing panic. These seasoned warriors, who moments before were planning their victory celebration, now stare in disbelief at the impossible scene in the valley below. Their champion, their giant, their seemingly invincible Goliath lies motionless in the grass, his own sword in the hands of the shepherd boy, who stands triumphant beside his massive form. The psychological impact is devastating. If Goliath could fall to this young Israelite, what protection did they have? What power could stand against the God of Israel? On the eastern hillside, the transformation is equally dramatic, but runs in the opposite direction. The Israelite soldiers, who have been paralysed by fear for 40 days, suddenly find their voices in a great roar of triumph that echoes off the surrounding hills. The sound builds and builds, a crescendo of relief and joy and renewed confidence that seems to shake the very foundations of the valley. "The Lord has given us victories," they cry. "God has delivered the Philistines into our hands." Swords are drawn from sheaths, not in fear this time, but in confidence. Spears are raised high, and the entire army begins to surge down the hillside like a mighty river breaking through a dam. King Saul, watching from his position among his officers, feels his own heart lift with amazement and gratitude. The burden of fear that has pressed down on him for weeks suddenly lifts, replaced by the returning memory of what it means to serve the living God. He gives the command that his army is already anticipating. Charge! The Philistine army, seeing the Israelites rushing toward them and having lost their champion and their confidence in a single moment, turns and flees. What had been an organised military force becomes a scattered mob running for their lives across the hills and valleys of the countryside. The rout is complete and devastating. But as the armies chase and flee across the landscape, David remains in the valley beside the brook, holding Goliath's head and looking up toward heaven with a heart full of gratitude. He has not forgotten, even in this moment of triumph, that the victory belongs to the Lord. This was never about David's skill with a sling. Though his years of practice were important, this was never about David's courage. Though his faith was essential, This was about God's power to save his people and his determination to show both Israel and the nations around them that he alone is God. David understands something that many of the celebrating soldiers rushing past him have not yet grasped. This victory in the valley of Elah is not an end in itself, but a beginning. It's a demonstration of what becomes possible when someone is willing to trust completely in God's power and step forward in faith, even when the circumstances seem impossible. As David picks up his simple staff and adjusts his shepherd's bag, still containing 4 unused stones, he reflects on the events of the day. This morning he was simply bringing food to his brothers. Now he has become the deliverer of Israel, the slayer of giants, the one through whom God chose to demonstrate his power to the nations. But David's heart remains humble. He knows that he was simply the instrument God chose to use. The smooth stones came from God's creation. The skill to use the sling came from God's provision of years in the wilderness. The courage to step forward came from God's faithfulness in past trials. Even the opportunity to be in the valley today came from God's sovereign orchestration of events. As the sun begins to set over the valley of Elah, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, David begins the journey back up the hillside. Behind him, the brook continues to flow peacefully, its waters singing the same gentle song they sang this morning, as if nothing extraordinary had happened here at all. But everything has changed. Israel has been delivered from their enemies. The name of the Lord has been glorified before the nations. Fear has been replaced with faith, and despair has given way to hope. Most importantly, everyone who witnessed this day now knows with certainty that there is a God in Israel, and that the battle belongs to the Lord. The young shepherd boy who walked down into the valley, carrying only his simple faith and his trust in God, walks back up the hillside as a champion. But he carries with him the same faith and the same trust, because he understands that these were the real weapons that won the victory. Size and strength and bronze armour are nothing compared to the power of the living God when it flows through a heart that trusts him completely. As David rejoins the celebrating Israelite army, his brothers look at him with new eyes. Eliab, who scolded him harshly this morning, now embraces him with tears of joy and amazement. The soldiers who barely noticed the young shepherd this morning now gather around him with respect and wonder, eager to hear him tell the story of his victory. But David's first words are not about his own actions or his own courage. Instead, he lifts his eyes toward heaven and says simply, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who has delivered his people this day." The victory belongs to the Lord, and David never forgets it. This understanding, this heart of worship and gratitude, even in the moment of triumph, is what will carry David through all the challenges that lie ahead in his remarkable life. For this is not the end of David's story, but the beginning. This day in the valley of Elah reveals the heart of a shepherd who will one day be king, a man after God's own heart, who will lead Israel with the same faith and trust he showed when facing a giant with nothing but a sling and the name of the Lord. As we reflect on this timeless story of David and Goliath, we discover that it offers us profound truths that speak directly to our own lives and challenges. The Valley of Elah becomes a classroom where God teaches us about faith, courage, preparation, and the source of true victory. Let's explore these lessons together, allowing them to settle into our hearts like seeds planted in good soil. One of the most striking aspects of David's story is how thoroughly unlikely he seems as a champion. When the prophet Samuel came to Jesse's house to anoint the next king of Israel, Jesse didn't even bother to call David in from the fields at first. David was the youngest, the smallest, the one everyone overlooked. Even his own brothers saw him as insignificant, more of an annoyance than a hero. Yet God specifically chose this overlooked shepherd boy to accomplish what none of Israel's mighty warriors dared attempt. This pattern runs throughout Scripture and continues in our world today. God delights in using people the world considers insignificant to accomplish his greatest purposes. He chooses the weak to shame the strong, the foolish to confound the wise, the humble to teach the proud. This truth offers tremendous encouragement to anyone who has ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or insignificant. Perhaps you feel too young, too old, too inexperienced, or too ordinary to make a difference. Perhaps others have dismissed your dreams or minimized your contributions. If so, you're in excellent company. Moses felt too inadequate to speak for God. Gideon felt too weak to lead an army. Esther felt too powerless to influence a king. Mary felt too young to bear the Messiah. But God sees what others miss. He looks at the heart while others focus on outward appearances. He values faithfulness over fame, character over credentials, availability over ability. When you feel small in the eyes of the world, remember that you serve a God who specializes in doing extraordinary things through ordinary people who trust him completely. The key is not to become someone else, but to offer who you already are to God with complete surrender. David didn't try to become a traditional warrior. He remained a shepherd who trusted God. Your background, your personality, your unique experiences and perspective are not accidents. They are part of God's preparation for the work he has planned for you. David's courage in facing Goliath didn't appear suddenly on the day of battle. It was forged over years of faithful service in places where no one was watching except God. While tending his father's sheep in the wilderness, David faced lions and bears that threatened the flock. In those lonely, dangerous moments, with no audience to impress and no recognition to gain, David learned to depend completely on God's strength. These wilderness experiences became David's training ground. Each time he trusted God to help him protect the sheep, his faith grew stronger. Each time he saw God's faithfulness in the small things, his confidence in God's power increased. By the time he faced Goliath, David had a history with God, a track record of divine assistance that gave him unshakable confidence. This principle applies directly to our lives. The character we develop in private, the faithfulness we demonstrate when no one is watching, the trust we build through small challenges prepare us for the larger battles we'll face later. God often prepares us through what seem like insignificant experiences, developing in us the spiritual muscles we'll need for greater tasks. Perhaps you're in a season of quiet preparation right now. Maybe you're in a job that feels unimportant, dealing with challenges that seem mundane, or serving in ways that go unnoticed. Don't despise these experiences. See them as God's training ground, places where you can learn to trust him completely without the pressure of public attention. Every act of faithfulness in small things builds spiritual strength. Every time you choose to trust God rather than worry, you're developing the faith muscles you'll need for larger challenges. Every moment you spend in prayer, study and worship during the ordinary days creates the spiritual foundation that will hold firm when storms come. David's Psalms reflect a man who knew God intimately through countless hours of communion in the wilderness. His worship wasn't reserved for public occasions. It was the natural overflow of a heart that had learned to recognize God's presence in solitary places. This private relationship with God became the source of his public courage. The contrast between David's response to Goliath and that of Israel's army reveals the transformative power of proper perspective. The Israelite soldiers saw Goliath's size and focused on their own inadequacy. They measured themselves against the giant and found themselves wanting. Fear paralysed them because they were looking at the problem instead of at God. David saw the same giant but responded completely differently. Instead of focusing on Goliath's size, David focused on God's greatness. Instead of measuring himself against the Philistine champion, he remembered God's faithfulness in past challenges. Most importantly, David saw this confrontation not as David versus Goliath, but as the God of Israel versus the false gods of the Philistines. This shift in perspective made all the difference. When we focus on our problems, they appear insurmountable. When we focus on God, our problems find their proper proportion. The same challenge that paralyses us with fear can become an opportunity to witness God's power when we view it through the lens of faith. Your Goliath may not be a 9-foot giant in bronze armour, but it's probably just as real and just as intimidating. It might be a health diagnosis that fills you with dread, a financial crisis that keeps you awake at night, a broken relationship that seems beyond repair, or a dream that feels impossible to achieve. Whatever giant you're facing, the same God who empowered David is available to you today. The key is learning to see your challenges through God's eyes rather than your own. When you focus on how big your problems are, they grow larger in your mind, and your faith shrinks. But when you focus on how big your God is, your problems find their proper place, and your faith grows stronger. Faith doesn't mean pretending problems don't exist or minimizing real challenges. David didn't pretend Goliath was small. He acknowledged the giant's formidable appearance and weapons. But faith means recognizing that God is greater than any challenge we face, and that his power is available to those who trust him completely. Perhaps the most important lesson from David's story is his understanding that victory belongs to God alone. David never claimed credit for defeating Goliath. He never boasted about his skill with a sling or his courage in facing the giant. Instead, he consistently pointed to God as the source of his victory. This humility wasn't false modesty, it was accurate theology. David understood that without God's strength, he would have been just another casualty in the valley. With God's power, he became an instrument of divine deliverance. The difference was not in David himself, but in David's relationship with God and his willingness to trust completely in divine strength. This principle protects us from both despair and pride. When we face challenges that seem impossible, we can take courage from knowing that we don't have to rely on our own strength. The same God who empowered David is available to empower us. When we experience victory and success, we can maintain humility by remembering that every good gift comes from above. Recognizing that victory belongs to the Lord also frees us from the crushing pressure of trying to achieve success through our own efforts alone. We can work diligently, prepare thoroughly, and act courageously, but we do so knowing that ultimate success depends on God's blessing and power. This perspective brings both peace in the struggle and gratitude in the victory. As we conclude our time together in the valley of Elah, I want you to imagine yourself standing where David stood. The sun is setting behind you, casting long shadows across the grass. In front of you lies whatever giant has been challenging your faith, threatening your peace, or blocking your path forward. Your Goliath might be fear itself, that persistent anxiety that whispers lies about your future and your security. It might be doubt that questions God's goodness when life becomes difficult. Perhaps it's a pattern of sin that seems too strong to break, a relationship that appears too damaged to heal, or a dream that feels too big to pursue. Maybe your giant is loneliness that echoes in empty rooms and quiet evenings, or it could be anger that burns hot and destroys relationships. Perhaps it's despair that covers your days like a dark cloud. making it hard to see hope or purpose. Whatever giant you're facing, remember David's words. I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. You don't have to face your challenges alone. You don't have to rely solely on your own strength, wisdom, or resources. The same God who empowered a shepherd boy to defeat a giant warrior is present with you today. Like David, you may feel small and inadequate when you look at the size of your challenges. That's normal and even healthy, because it drives you to depend on God rather than yourself. But don't let the size of your problems overshadow the greatness of your God. Don't let the voice of your giant drown out the whisper of divine love that calls you forward in faith. Remember that God has been preparing you for this moment through all the quiet experiences of your life. Every time you've chosen trust over worry, every moment you've experienced God's faithfulness in small things, every prayer you've whispered in the darkness has been building the spiritual strength you need for this challenge. Take up your simple faith like David took up his sling. Select the smooth stones of God's promises that have been worn smooth by the flowing waters of his love. Step forward, not in your own strength, but in the name of the Lord who loves you completely and fights on your behalf. And remember, the battle belongs to the Lord. Your job is not to guarantee the outcome, but to trust the one who holds the outcome in his hands. Your calling is not to be strong enough to win, but to be faithful enough to step forward when God calls. As you face your giants, may you have David's courage to step forward, his faith to trust completely, and his wisdom to give God all the glory for whatever victories he grants. May you discover, as David did, that with God all things are possible, and that no giant is too large for the power of divine love. Let us pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the story of David and Goliath, which reminds us that you delight in using ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Help us to see our challenges through your eyes rather than our own fears. Give us David's courage to step forward when you call, his faith to trust in your power rather than our own strength, and his humility to give you glory for every victory. We place our giants before you today, Lord, whatever form they may take in our lives. We acknowledge that we cannot defeat them in our own strength, but we trust in your power to deliver us. Use our weaknesses to display your strength, our fears to showcase your faithfulness, and our victories to bring glory to your name. Help us to be faithful in the quiet places of preparation, knowing that you are building in us the character and faith we'll need for the challenges ahead. May we never forget that the battle belongs to you, and may we always be quick to give you praise for your goodness and mercy in our lives. In the name of Jesus, our Good Shepherd and mighty champion, we pray. Amen. Sleep well, dear friends, knowing that the same God who was with David in the valley is with you wherever your journey leads. May his peace guard your hearts and minds, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed faith to face whatever giants await. Until we meet again in another story, may God's love surround you like a shepherd's care, and may his strength be your portion in every season. Thank you for joining us at Sacred Slumber, where every story reminds us that we are deeply loved and never alone. Picture this: a young widow standing at a crossroads, dust swirling around her feet as she faces the most important decision of her life. Behind her lies everything familiar: her homeland, her people, her gods. Ahead stretches an uncertain path toward a foreign land with a grieving mother-in-law who has nothing left to offer but heartache. Most would choose the safety of the familiar. But Ruth, she chose love over security, loyalty over convenience, and in that single moment of breathtaking faithfulness, she stepped into a story that would echo through eternity. What if I told you that in the midst of hardship, one small act of kindness could change the course of history? The Book of Ruth isn't just another ancient tale gathering dust on library shelves. It's a masterpiece of hope, painted against the darkest canvas of human loss. This isn't a story of mighty warriors or thundering prophets. There are no plagues here, no walls crumbling at the sound of trumpets. Instead, we find something far more profound: the quiet power of unwavering devotion and the gentle hand of divine providence working through ordinary people making extraordinary choices. In a world that often celebrates the loud and flashy, Ruth's story whispers a different truth. It tells us that loyalty can triumph over loss, that kindness can overcome cruelty, and that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't found in earthquake or fire, but in the still, small voice of love, choosing to stay when everything else falls apart. This is a tale of hope, peace, and God's gentle provision. A story that begins with death and ends with life, starts with emptiness and concludes with abundance, opens with despair and closes with joy so profound it reverberates through generations. The beauty of Ruth's narrative lies not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. It's a story anyone can understand because it touches the universal human experiences of loss, love, loyalty, and redemption. Yet beneath this surface simplicity runs a current so deep it connects the heart of ancient Moab to the throne of David, and ultimately to a manger in Bethlehem, where another story of divine love would unfold centuries later. The story begins not with triumph, but with tragedy. Not in the promised land, but in foreign territory. Naomi, whose name ironically means pleasant, finds herself in the bitter reality of compound grief that would break most spirits entirely. She had left Bethlehem during a famine with her husband Elimelech and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, seeking survival in Moab, a land that was both geographically close to Israel and spiritually distant from its God. What started as a temporary sojourn became permanent residence when Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. In ancient times, widowhood wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was an economic and social death sentence. Women had little legal standing, no inheritance rights, and depended entirely on male relatives for protection and provision. Yet Naomi found a glimmer of hope when her sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. These marriages, while controversial by Israelite standards, brought companionship and the promise of grandchildren who would carry on the family name. But hope proved fleeting. After about 10 years in Moab, both sons died, leaving 3 widows to face an uncertain future together. The Hebrew text doesn't elaborate on how they died. Perhaps disease, perhaps accident, perhaps the simple harsh realities of ancient life. What matters isn't the how, but the devastation that followed. Naomi found herself stripped of everything that defined her identity: wife, mother, provider, protector. She was a living emblem of loss, carrying nothing but grief and 2 foreign daughters-in-law who had their own mourning to bear. When news reached Moab that the famine in Bethlehem had ended, Naomi made a decision, born of both hope and desperation. She would return to her homeland, to her people, to whatever remained of her former life. It was a journey of approximately 50 miles, but It might as well have been to the moon for all the security it promised. She was returning not as the confident woman who had left with her family, but as a broken widow with empty hands and an empty womb, carrying nothing but memories of better days. The moment of truth came when it was time to say goodbye. Standing at the border between Moab and Israel, Naomi turned to her daughters-in-law with words that revealed both her love for them and her own despair. "Go back," she urged them, "each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me." It was a release tinged with blessing, an act of selfless love that put their welfare above her own companionship. Orpah, after much weeping and embracing, made the practical choice. She kissed Naomi goodbye and returned to her people and her gods. History doesn't judge her for this decision. It was sensible, even wise by worldly standards. She was young enough to remarry, to find security and happiness in familiar surroundings. Her choice was understandable, logical, and completely reasonable. But Ruth made a choice that defied every rational calculation. When Naomi urged her to follow Orpah's example, Ruth responded with words that have echoed through millennia, words that capture the very essence of covenant love. "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." This wasn't a momentary burst of emotion. It was a deliberate, irrevocable commitment. Ruth wasn't just choosing to accompany Naomi. She was choosing to abandon everything familiar for everything unknown. She was trading the security of her homeland for the uncertainty of being a foreign widow in Israel. She was exchanging the comfort of her people's acceptance for the likelihood of being viewed as an outsider, even an enemy, given the historical tensions between Moab and Israel. Most remarkably, Ruth was choosing Naomi's God over her own family deities. In the ancient world, this wasn't merely a personal preference. It was a complete transformation of identity, worldview, and destiny. She was stepping away from the gods she had known since childhood and embracing the God of Israel, whom she knew primarily through the testimony of her mother-in-law's life and loss. The journey to Bethlehem began with two broken women walking together toward an uncertain future, but it was really the beginning of one of history's most beautiful stories of redemption. Ruth's choice to stay wasn't just loyalty to Naomi, it was an unconscious choice to step into the stream of God's redemptive plan for humanity. Without knowing it, she was walking not just toward Bethlehem, but toward her destiny as an ancestor of kings and ultimately of the King of Kings. The arrival in Bethlehem was far from triumphant. When Naomi and Ruth entered the town, the women who had known Naomi before could hardly believe their eyes. "Can this be Naomi?" they asked, seeing the toll that loss and hardship had taken on their former neighbour. Naomi's response revealed the depth of her pain. "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." It was barley harvest time, a detail that might seem incidental, but carries profound significance. In God's economy, timing is never accidental. They arrived not during the lean months when work was scarce and food scarcer, but during the season of harvest when there might be opportunities for survival. Still, being widowed foreigners in a patriarchal society meant they stood at the very bottom of the social ladder, dependent on the kindness of others and whatever work Ruth could find. Ruth, whose name likely means friendship or companion, immediately proved the accuracy of her name through her actions. Without waiting for Naomi to devise a plan or wallowing in self-pity over their circumstances, she took initiative with the words that reveal her character. "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." This simple statement masks the courage it required. Ruth was volunteering to do backbreaking labour in the scorching sun, to work alongside the lowest members of society, to face possible harassment or rejection, all to provide for the woman she had chosen to love. Gleaning was God's provision for the poor, embedded in the law of Moses as a safety net for society's most vulnerable. Landowners were commanded not to harvest to the very edges of their fields and not to go back for grain that was dropped or missed. This leftover grain could be gathered by widows, orphans and foreigners, the three groups most at risk in ancient society. It was honest work, but humble work, requiring long hours bent over in the heat, gathering grain stalk by stalk, hoping for enough to make a small meal. The providential nature of Ruth's story becomes apparent in the simple phrase, "as it turned out." She happened to find herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, a prominent man from Elimelech's clan. But in God's story, there are no coincidences, only the invisible hand of providence, orchestrating circumstances for purposes beyond human understanding. Boaz first noticed Ruth through his foreman's report. When he asked about the young woman working diligently in his field, he learned her identity. She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. That description carried weight. Moabites were not generally welcomed in Israelite society. They were descendants of Lot through an incestuous relationship, and their nation had historically been hostile to Israel. For Ruth to be identified first by her nationality rather than her name suggests the social barriers she faced. Yet when Boaz observed Ruth personally, he saw beyond her foreign origins to her character. He watched her work with steady dedication, saw her respectful interaction with his workers, and most importantly, he had heard of her kindness to Naomi. In a society that valued family loyalty above almost all other virtues, Ruth's devotion to her mother-in-law had become legendary. Word had spread throughout Bethlehem of the young Moabite woman who had abandoned everything to care for her husband's mother. Boaz's first words to Ruth were revolutionary for their kindness. "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me." He was offering her protection, stability, and dignity. In ancient times, young women working in fields were vulnerable to harassment and worse. By placing her under his personal protection and encouraging her to work alongside his regular female employees rather than as a desperate outsider, Boaz was treating Ruth not as a foreign charity case, but as a valued person worthy of respect. But his kindness went further. He instructed his workers to let her drink from their water jars when she was thirsty, in a time and place where clean water was precious. He told her to eat with his harvesting crew, sharing in the roasted grain and vinegar that sustained the workers. Most remarkably, he quietly instructed his harvesters to pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. Ruth's response to this unexpected kindness reveals both her humility and her wisdom. She fell prostrate before Boaz, asking, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Her question acknowledges her outsider status while expressing genuine gratitude for treatment she neither expected nor felt she deserved. Boaz's answer illuminates the reputation Ruth had already built in Bethlehem. "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." These words are more than polite conversation. They're a blessing that recognises Ruth's choice to trust in Israel's God. The image of taking refuge under God's wings evokes the protective presence of the Almighty, like a bird sheltering its young. Boaz was acknowledging that Ruth's kindness to Naomi was really an act of faith, a stepping into the covenant community of Israel despite her foreign birth. That day Ruth gathered approximately an ephah of barley, about half a bushel, far more than a typical gleaner could hope to gather. When she returned home and showed Naomi her extraordinary harvest, along with the leftover food from the workers' meal, Naomi immediately recognized God's hand in these events. Her response, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead," reveals her growing awareness that their apparent coincidental encounter with Boaz was actually divine appointment. When Naomi learned that the field owner was Boaz, her excitement was palpable. "The man is our close relative," she explained to Ruth. "He is one of our kinsman redeemers." This wasn't just good news, it was the first glimpse of hope Naomi had felt since leaving Moab. The kinsman redeemer system was God's provision for protecting family lines and property. A close male relative had both the right and responsibility to buy back family land that had been sold due to poverty and to marry a widowed relative to preserve the family name and inheritance. Ruth continued working in Boaz's fields through both the barley and wheat harvests, likely a period of several months. Day after day, she laboured faithfully, building a reputation for diligence and integrity, while gradually becoming part of the community. She was no longer just the Moabite woman, but Ruth, the devoted daughter-in-law whose character spoke louder than her foreign birth. During this time, a subtle transformation was taking place. Ruth was learning the ways of Israel, observing their customs, participating in their community life. She was also, unknowingly, becoming the object of Boaz's growing admiration and affection. Though significantly older than Ruth, Boaz found himself drawn not to her physical beauty, but to the beauty of her character, her loyalty, her faith, and her gentle strength. This season in the fields was more than economic survival. It was Ruth's integration into the covenant community of Israel and the beginning of a love story that would have implications far beyond the borders of Bethlehem. As the harvest season continued, the relationship between Ruth and Boaz deepened through daily interactions marked by mutual respect and growing affection. Boaz's kindness wasn't mere politeness, it was the recognition of extraordinary character in someone society might easily overlook. Every morning when Ruth arrived in his fields, every conversation they shared, every protective gesture he made, was weaving a tapestry of love, built on a foundation of honour and integrity. Naomi, meanwhile, was experiencing her own transformation. The bitterness that had defined her return to Bethlehem was gradually giving way to something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Watching Ruth's faithful service and witnessing Boaz's unprecedented kindness toward her daughter-in-law, Naomi began to see the hand of God moving in their circumstances. The woman who had declared herself empty was beginning to see the possibility of fullness once again. It was Naomi who first recognized what Ruth, in her humility and focus on daily survival, might have missed. Boaz's interest was more than benevolent concern for a hard-working gleaner. His protection of Ruth, his generous provisions, his public praise of her character, all pointed to something deeper. In a culture where marriages were often arranged for economic and social advantage, here was a man of standing choosing to honour a foreign widow not for what she could bring him, but for who she was. The harvest season was also a time of community celebration. The successful gathering of crops meant survival for another year, and the people of Bethlehem marked these occasions with festivals and gatherings. During these celebrations, Ruth would have had opportunities to observe Israelite customs, to learn their songs and stories, to better understand the God she had chosen to follow. She was becoming not just a resident of Bethlehem, but a true daughter of Israel. Boaz's generosity during this time went far beyond legal requirements or social expectations. The law required landowners to allow gleaning but it didn't require them to ensure the gleaners found substantial amounts. When Boaz instructed his workers to intentionally drop extra grain for Ruth, he was going above and beyond duty into the realm of love. When he invited her to share meals with his workers, he was treating her as family rather than charity case. The other workers in the field would have noticed this special treatment. In small communities, nothing goes unobserved, and Boaz's obvious favour toward Ruth would have been the subject of much discussion. Yet the narrative suggests this talk was positive rather than scandalous. Ruth's reputation for integrity and Boaz's character as a righteous man meant their growing relationship was viewed with approval rather than suspicion. During these months, Ruth was also learning about the God of Israel through observation and experience. She saw how the law protected the vulnerable, how the community cared for its members, how even foreigners could find acceptance when they showed faithfulness. The God she had committed to following in her pledge to Naomi was revealing himself to be trustworthy through the kindness of his people. The emotional climate was changing for all three main characters. Ruth, while still focused on providing for Naomi, was discovering that life could hold possibilities beyond mere survival. Naomi was moving from despair to cautious optimism as she watched events unfold. And Boaz, a man who might have remained unmarried and childless, was finding his heart stirred by a woman whose character exemplified everything he valued. The religious significance of this season cannot be understated. Ruth was effectively completing her conversion to Judaism not through formal ceremony, but through lived experience. She was learning to trust in the God of Israel, not through theological instruction, but through witnessing his provision and protection. Her faith was being refined and deepened through the daily rhythm of work, community, and growing relationship with both Naomi and Boaz. The harvest season was also a time when family relationships and inheritance rights became particularly relevant. With successful crops came discussions of land ownership, family obligations, and the duties of kinsman redeemers. Naomi would have been acutely aware of these conversations, knowing that her late husband's property rights and family obligations remained unresolved. The presence of a kinsman redeemer like Boaz, combined with his obvious interest in Ruth, would have sparked hope for resolution of their precarious situation. As the wheat harvest drew to a close, the foundations had been laid for the dramatic events that would follow. Ruth had proven her character through months of faithful work. Boaz had demonstrated his integrity and growing love through consistent kindness. Naomi had moved from bitter resignation to hopeful planning. The community had accepted Ruth as one of their own, and God's providence had been orchestrating circumstances toward a conclusion that would provide redemption, love, and legacy for generations to come. The harvest season was ending, and with it came both celebration and anxiety about the future. Naomi, who had been quietly observing the growing relationship between Ruth and Boaz, decided it was time to take decisive action. Her plan, which she shared with Ruth, was both bold and risky. Ruth would approach Boaz at the threshing floor during the harvest festival and essentially propose marriage by invoking his rights and responsibilities as a kinsman redeemer. "My daughter," Naomi said to Ruth, "I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for." This wasn't merely matchmaking, it was strategic thinking about survival and security. Naomi understood that while Boaz's kindness during harvest season had been extraordinary, the relationship needed to move beyond casual benevolence to formal commitment if it were to provide lasting security for both women. The plan required enormous courage from Ruth. She would need to bathe, perfume herself, put on her best clothes, and go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be winnowing barley. After he had eaten and drunk and was sleeping beside the grain pile, she was to uncover his feet and lie down. When he woke and asked what she wanted, she was to say, Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you're a kinsman redeemer. This might sound forward by modern standards, but it was actually a proper, though bold, way for a woman to request marriage from a kinsman redeemer. The act of lying at his feet was a gesture of submission and trust. The request to spread his garment over her was asking him to take her under his protection as his wife. The same imagery Boaz had used earlier when he spoke of Ruth taking refuge under God's wings. Ruth's response to this plan reveals the depth of her trust in Naomi. I will do whatever you say. She didn't question the wisdom of the approach or worry about the potential for misunderstanding or rejection. She had committed herself to following Naomi's guidance, and she would do so even in this most vulnerable moment. The night at the threshing floor was a pivotal moment in the story. Ruth followed Naomi's instructions precisely, approaching quietly and lying at Boaz's feet after he had fallen asleep. Around midnight, Boaz stirred and discovered someone at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked in the darkness. Ruth's answer was direct and humble. "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you're a kinsman redeemer." She was formally requesting that he fulfill his family obligations by marrying her, thereby providing security for both her and Naomi, and potentially redeeming Elimelech's family property. Boaz's response exceeded Ruth's hopes. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he said. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." He was acknowledging that Ruth's approach to him wasn't born of desperation or opportunism, but of faithfulness to family obligations and trust in God's provision. However, Boaz revealed a complication Ruth hadn't known about. There was another kinsman redeemer who had a closer family relationship and therefore first rights to redeem Elimelech's property and marry Ruth. "Although it is true that I am near of kin," Boaz explained, "there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I." This was devastating news, but Boaz assured Ruth that the matter would be resolved properly according to law and custom. Boaz's handling of this delicate situation reveals his character perfectly. He could have taken advantage of Ruth's vulnerable position, but instead he protected her reputation and committed himself to resolving the legal complications honourably. He told Ruth to stay until morning, but leave before anyone could recognise her, protecting her from potential scandal. Before she left, he filled her cloak with 6 measures of barley, ensuring she didn't return to Naomi empty-handed. When Ruth returned home and reported everything to Naomi, the older woman's response was confident. "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." Naomi knew Boaz well enough to trust that he would handle the situation with integrity and dispatch. That very morning, Boaz went to the city gate, the place where legal and business matters were conducted in ancient Israel. He sat down and waited for the other kinsman redeemer to pass by. When the man appeared, Boaz called him over and assembled a group of 10 elders as witnesses for the legal proceedings that would follow. The negotiation was masterful. Boaz began by telling the man about a piece of land that had belonged to their relative Elimelech, which Naomi was selling. According to law, the nearest kinsman redeemer had first rights to purchase the property, to keep it in the family. The man was interested until Boaz explained the complete package. "On the day you buy the land from Naomi," Boaz said, "you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." This changed everything. Purchasing the land was one thing, but marrying Ruth meant taking responsibility for supporting her and Naomi, and any sons born to Ruth would inherit the redeemed property rather than being part of the Redeemer's own family line. The closer kinsman declined. "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." His refusal, while disappointing for him personally, was providential for Ruth and Boaz. To formalize the transaction, the man took off his sandal and gave it to Boaz, the customary way of transferring rights in Israel. Boaz then made a public declaration before the assembled witnesses. "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown." The witnesses responded with a beautiful blessing. "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." This blessing was prophetic in ways the speakers couldn't imagine. They were comparing Ruth to the matriarchs of Israel and expressing hope for the continuation of significant family lines. Their mention of Perez was particularly significant, as Perez was an ancestor of Boaz and would be an ancestor of David and ultimately Jesus. The marriage between Ruth and Boaz was celebrated throughout Bethlehem. Here was a love story that had captured the community's imagination. The virtuous foreign woman and the honourable landowner, brought together by providence and confirmed by their own choices of faithfulness and integrity. Their wedding was not just a personal celebration, but a community affirmation of God's goodness and the power of loyal love. Ruth, who had come to Bethlehem as a destitute foreign widow, was now the wife of one of the town's most respected men. Naomi, who had returned empty, was now provided for and honoured as the mother-in-law of a prominent family. Boaz, who might have remained childless, was married to a woman whose character and beauty had won his heart. The redemption was complete, financially, socially, emotionally, and spiritually. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz represented more than the happy ending to a beautiful love story. It was the beginning of a legacy that would reshape history. Their union produced a son named Obed, whose birth brought completion to the themes of redemption and restoration that had woven throughout the narrative. When the women of Bethlehem saw Naomi holding her grandson, they declared, "Naomi has a son," acknowledging that through Ruth's faithfulness, Naomi's line would continue. The birth of Obed was celebrated as divine vindication of Ruth's loyalty and God's faithfulness to his people. The same women who had witnessed Naomi's bitter return to Bethlehem now rejoiced with her in this ultimate reversal of fortune. "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer," they told Naomi. "May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who's better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." The significance of being better than 7 sons cannot be overstated in a culture that prized male heirs above all other blessings. 7 was the number of completeness and perfection. So to say Ruth was better than 7 sons was to declare her the ultimate blessing, a foreign woman who had proven more valuable than the greatest treasure a family could hope for. But the story of Ruth and Boaz was part of a much larger narrative that wouldn't be fully revealed for generations. Their son Obed became the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, the shepherd boy who would become Israel's greatest king. Through their lineage, Ruth, the Moabite widow, became the great-grandmother of the man after God's own heart, whose dynasty would rule Israel and whose throne God promised would endure forever. The genealogy that concludes the book of Ruth traces the line from Perez, son of Judah and Tamar, through Boaz and Ruth to David, showing how Ruth's faithfulness became part of the messianic line. What began as a simple act of loyalty to a grieving mother-in-law ultimately contributed to God's plan for redeeming all humanity. Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi and adopt Israel's God placed her squarely in the centre of salvation history. This foreign woman, who could have been excluded from the covenant community, instead became one of only 4 women mentioned in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, along with Tamar, Rahab and Bathsheba. Each of these women had unusual circumstances that made their inclusion remarkable, but Ruth's story is particularly beautiful because it demonstrates how God's love extends beyond ethnic and national boundaries to embrace all who respond to him in faith. The legacy of Ruth extends beyond genealogy to the realm of character and faith. Her story became a teaching tool for generations of Israelites about the power of loyal love, the Hebrew concept of hesed that encompasses devotion, faithfulness, and sacrificial commitment. Ruth embodied hesed in her relationship with Naomi, and Boaz demonstrated it in his treatment of Ruth. Their marriage was built on this foundation of covenant love that mirrors God's relationship with his people. Ruth's integration into Israelite society also established an important precedent for how foreigners could be welcomed into the covenant community. Her acceptance wasn't based on her ethnicity or social status, but on her character and faith. She proved that nationality was less important than loyalty, that birth circumstances mattered less than personal choices, and that God's family was open to all who chose to belong to it. The story of Ruth also demonstrates God's providence in the seemingly ordinary events of life. There were no dramatic miracles in Ruth's story, no parting of seas or walls falling down, yet God's hand guided every step. The timing of their arrival during harvest season, the chance encounter with Boaz's field, the availability of the kinsman-redeemer laws, the other redeemer's decision to decline his rights, all of these coincidences work together to create the perfect conditions for redemption and blessing. For Naomi, Ruth's legacy meant the restoration of everything she thought she had lost forever. Through Ruth's son, Naomi's family line continued, her security was assured, and her later years were filled with joy instead of bitterness. The woman who had asked to be called Mara, bitter, was now surrounded by the sweetness of new life and hope. For Boaz, marrying Ruth brought fulfillment he might never have expected. Instead of remaining childless, he became the father of a son who would carry on his name and values. His kindness to a foreign gleaner was rewarded with a love that enriched his life and extended his influence through generations. For Bethlehem and the wider community, Ruth's story became a testament to the power of character over circumstances. Her reputation for faithfulness outlasted her foreign origins, and her descendants would bring honour to the very town where she had once worked humbly in the fields. The house of bread, Bethlehem's meaning, became truly blessed through the presence of this woman who had chosen loyalty over security. The themes of Ruth's story, loyalty rewarded, faithfulness blessed, love conquering prejudice, and providence working through ordinary events, would resonate throughout Scripture and human experience. Her example of sacrificial love prefigures the ultimate sacrifice that would come through her descendant, Jesus, who would demonstrate the same kind of loyal love on a cosmic scale. Ruth's legacy teaches us that small acts of faithfulness can have eternal consequences, that God's plans often work through unlikely people in unexpected ways, and that the greatest blessings sometimes come disguised as difficult choices. Her decision to stay with Naomi seemed like the harder path, but it led to blessings she could never have imagined. As we close the pages of Ruth's story, we're left not with the thunderous echoes of conquest or the dramatic flourishes of miracle, but with something far more profound, the quiet certainty that love endures, that faithfulness matters, and that God's gentle hand guides even the most ordinary moments toward extraordinary purposes. Ruth's tale doesn't shout at us, it whispers truths that settle into our hearts, like seeds waiting for the right season to bloom. The beauty of Ruth's narrative lies in its accessibility. We may never face exile in a foreign land or need to glean in harvest fields, but we all encounter crossroads where we must choose between security and loyalty, between what's easy and what's right. Ruth's story reminds us that these moments, when we choose love over convenience, faithfulness over comfort, are the building blocks of legacy. In our contemporary world, where relationships are often disposable and commitment is seen as restriction rather than strength, Ruth's devotion to Naomi offers a counter-narrative. Her famous words, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay," weren't just poetry. They were a life philosophy that valued connection over independence, loyalty over self-preservation. In an age of radical individualism, Ruth models radical commitment. Her story also speaks to anyone who has ever felt like an outsider. Ruth was foreign by birth, widowed by circumstance, and poor by necessity. 3 strikes that should have kept her on society's margins. Yet through character and faith, she moved from the periphery to the centre of God's plan. Her journey from Moabite stranger to beloved ancestor of kings offers hope to everyone who has wondered if their background, circumstances, or mistakes disqualify them from significance. The gentleness of God's providence in Ruth's story offers comfort to those who wonder if their lives matter in the grand scheme of things. There were no burning bushes or angelic visitations in Ruth's experience, just the quiet orchestration of ordinary events toward extraordinary outcomes. Her story suggests that God is just as present in the mundane moments as in the miraculous ones, working through harvest seasons and chance encounters to weave tapestries of grace. For those experiencing seasons of loss like Naomi, Ruth's story offers hope without minimizing pain. Naomi's bitterness was real and justified. She had lost everything that mattered to her. Yet through Ruth's faithfulness and God's providence, her empty hands were filled again. The story doesn't suggest that loss isn't real or that pain isn't valid, but it does promise that emptiness isn't the end of the story. Boaz represents the power of kindness and integrity in a world that often seems harsh and selfish. His treatment of Ruth demonstrates how one person's compassion can transform another's entire trajectory. He saw beyond her circumstances to her character, beyond her foreignness to her faithfulness. In doing so, he models how we might approach the marginalised and struggling people in our own communities. The redemption theme that runs throughout Ruth's story speaks to our deepest longing for second chances and new beginnings. Ruth redeemed Naomi's emptiness through loyalty. Boaz redeemed Ruth's vulnerability through love. Their union redeemed a family line that seemed destined for extinction. This pattern of redemption points toward the ultimate Redeemer who would come through their lineage, offering restoration to all who are broken, lost, or forgotten. Perhaps most powerfully, Ruth's story reminds us that our choices ripple through eternity in ways we cannot foresee. When Ruth chose to stay with Naomi, she had no idea she was choosing to become the great-grandmother of King David or an ancestor of Jesus. She simply chose love. Her decision, made in a moment of grief and uncertainty, affected the course of history and the salvation of the world. The story teaches us that faithfulness is its own reward, but it's also the foundation for blessings we cannot imagine. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi brought her love with Boaz. Her willingness to work humbly brought her honour. Her choice to embrace Israel's God brought her into the centre of his redemptive plan. As we reflect on Ruth's journey from foreign widow to beloved ancestor, we're reminded that God delights in using the unlikely and the overlooked. He chooses the humble to confound the mighty, the faithful to accomplish the impossible, the loving to heal the broken. Ruth's story is ultimately not about her exceptional character, though that was remarkable, but about God's exceptional grace working through ordinary obedience. In a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain, Ruth's story offers the gentle assurance that someone is writing a larger story, weaving together our small acts of faithfulness into a tapestry of purpose and beauty. Every choice to love instead of abandon, to stay instead of leave, to serve instead of demand, becomes part of a narrative larger than ourselves. The final truth Ruth's story whispers to our hearts is perhaps the most beautiful of all. Sometimes the smallest acts of love carry the weight of eternity. A foreign woman's decision to care for her grieving mother-in-law became part of the story that leads to Christmas morning and the cross of Calvary. Her simple faithfulness participated in God's plan to redeem not just a family, but a world. Ruth's legacy lives on not only in the genealogies of Scripture, but in every act of sacrificial love, every choice of loyalty over convenience, every decision to stay when leaving would be easier. Her story continues in our stories when we choose, as she did, to let love be our guide and faithfulness be our strength. In the end, Ruth teaches us that we don't need to be heroes to be heroic. We don't need to be perfect to be used by God. And we don't need to see the whole staircase to take the next step of faith. Sometimes, all that's required is the courage to say, like Ruth, "Where you go, I will go," and trust that the God who guided her steps will guide ours as well. The gentle hope of Ruth's story rests in this beautiful truth. In God's economy, no act of love is ever wasted, no gesture of faithfulness ever forgotten, and no choice to follow him ever in vain. Sometimes the smallest acts of love carry the weight of eternity, echoing through generations and touching the very heart of God's redemptive plan for humanity. What if I told you there's a Bible story where a piece of iron floated, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally floated on water like a cork bobbing on the surface of a pond? You've heard of Moses parting the Red Sea. You know about David slaying Goliath. The story of Daniel in the lion's den rolls off your tongue, but tucked away in the pages of 2 Kings chapter 6 lies one of the most overlooked miracles in all of Scripture. A miracle so humble, so seemingly insignificant, that most people skip right over it without a second thought. Yet this brief narrative, comprising only 6 verses, contains profound truths about faith, responsibility, and the God who cares about the smallest details of our lives. During the prophetic ministry of Elisha, miracles often happened in ordinary, almost mundane situations. While his predecessor, Elijah, called down fire from heaven and raised the dead, Elisha's ministry was marked by intimate, practical interventions, healing bitter water, multiplying oil for a widow's debt, and yes, making iron float. This story is brief in Scripture but rich in meaning, a testament to faith in small things, a reminder that no problem is too insignificant for divine intervention. In a world where we're conditioned to believe that God only shows up for the spectacular, the floating axe head whispers a different truth. Sometimes the most profound miracles happen in the most ordinary moments of our lives. The sun cast long shadows across the Jordan River Valley as another day began in the divided kingdom of Israel. It was a time of political turmoil and spiritual awakening, when the northern kingdom teetered between apostasy and revival. largely dependent on the influence of God's prophets. This was the era of Elisha's ministry, roughly 850 BC, decades after the dramatic departure of his mentor Elijah in a chariot of fire. The sons of the prophets, a community of disciples and spiritual students gathered around Elisha, had been growing steadily. These weren't prophets in the sense of fortune tellers or mystics, but rather men dedicated to learning God's ways, studying his word, and serving under the guidance of established prophets like Elisha. Think of them as a biblical seminary, a community of faith where young men came to deepen their understanding of the divine and prepare for ministry. Their current living situation had become cramped and inadequate. What had once been sufficient space for a handful of devoted followers was now bursting at the seams. The community was thriving, and with growth came practical challenges. They needed more room, more space to gather, to learn, to live together in their pursuit of spiritual wisdom. "The place where we dwell with you is too small for us," they told Elisha one morning, their voices carrying the respectful deference due their teacher, but also the practical urgency of their situation. It wasn't a complaint so much as an observation, a statement of fact that required action. Their solution was both practical and communal. They would go to the Jordan River region and gather timber to construct a larger dwelling place. The Jordan Valley was known for its trees, sycamores, willows, and other varieties that could provide the lumber they needed. It was honest work, the kind of labour that built both character and community as they worked side by side toward a common goal. "Let us go to the Jordan," they proposed, "and let every man take a beam from there, and let us make a place where we may dwell." The plan was simple, straightforward, and entirely reasonable. They weren't asking for a miracle or divine provision dropped from heaven. They were willing to work, to sweat, to use their hands and their backs to meet their need. Elisha, ever the encouraging leader, gave his blessing. Go. But their invitation touched his heart. "Please consent to go with your servants." They wanted their teacher among them, not just giving permission but participating in their labour. And Elisha, who could have remained comfortably behind while his students did the hard work, responded with characteristic humility, "I will go." So the small company set out for the Jordan, tools in hand, ready to transform their vision into reality. The Jordan River had witnessed countless biblical events. It was here that Joshua led the Israelites into the Promised Land, where the priest's feet touched the water and it parted just as the Red Sea had done for Moses. It was in these very waters that centuries later John the Baptist would immerse Jesus Christ himself. But on this particular day, there would be no grand procession, no miraculous river crossing, just a group of dedicated men heading to the riverside to cut timber, their hearts full of purpose and their hands ready for honest labour. The Jordan Valley stretched before them, its banks lined with the trees they needed, its waters flowing steadily toward the Dead Sea, carrying with it the silt and sediment of the highlands above. None of them could have imagined that before the day was through, these same waters would become the stage for a miracle that defied every law of physics they understood. The ordinary was about to become extraordinary, but for now it was simply another day of work in service to God and community. The work began in earnest as the sun climbed higher in the morning sky. The sounds of labour filled the Jordan Valley, the rhythmic thud of axes biting into wood, the crack and groan of falling timber, the calls of men coordinating their efforts. It was satisfying work, the kind that produces visible results and builds camaraderie among those who share the burden. Among the workers was a young man whose name history has forgotten, but whose predicament would echo through the ages. Unlike some of his fellow students who had brought their own tools, he had needed to borrow an axe for the day's work. In ancient Israel, this was no small matter. Iron tools were precious commodities, expensive and carefully maintained. They weren't mass-produced items you could easily replace if lost or damaged. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age had been gradual in Israel, and iron tools still represented significant investment. A good axe might cost several days' wages for an ordinary labourer. For a student prophet, likely supported by the generosity of others and focused on spiritual rather than material pursuits, such a tool was far beyond his means to purchase. Borrowing the axe wasn't just a casual favour between friends. It was a serious responsibility, a trust that carried moral and financial weight. The lender had placed confidence in this young man's character and ability to care for a valuable tool. To lose or damage it would bring not only financial burden, but also shame and damaged relationships within the community. The young man worked diligently, perhaps even more carefully than usual, acutely aware of the responsibility he carried. The axe felt good in his hands, well balanced, sharp, effective. Each swing brought down chips of wood as he worked to shape a beam for their new dwelling. The rhythm of the work was almost meditative. Lift, aim, strike, lift, aim, strike. Then it happened. Mid-swing, with no warning, the iron head of the axe flew off the handle. The wooden shaft, suddenly lightened, completed its arc uselessly through the air, while the heavy iron head traced a different trajectory entirely. Time seemed to slow as the young man watched in horror as the precious tool spun through the air and landed with a splash in the muddy waters of the Jordan. "Alas, my master, it was borrowed!" The cry escaped his lips before he could stop it, a wail of despair that carried all the weight of his predicament. This wasn't merely an inconvenience or a temporary setback. This was a crisis that threatened his integrity, his relationships, and his financial future. The Jordan River at this point wasn't like a clear mountain stream, where you might hope to spot a lost item on the bottom. Fed by tributaries from the hill country, it carried sediment and silt that made the water murky and opaque. The riverbed was soft mud, perfect for swallowing a heavy piece of iron and holding it fast. Even if the water had been crystal clear, the iron head would have sunk quickly into the soft bottom, possibly disappearing entirely into the muck. The other workers had stopped their labour at the sound of his cry. Elisha, who had been moving among them, observing the work and encouraging the labourers, turned his attention to the young man's distress. Here was a scene that any leader would recognise, a moment when accident and circumstance converge to create a problem that seems insurmountable. For the young man, the calculations were stark and frightening. How long would he need to work to earn enough to replace the axe? How could he face the man who had trusted him with this valuable tool? What would this mean for his standing in the community of prophets? The borrowed axe represented more than just iron and wood. It was a symbol of trust, responsibility, and his place in the community. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Here they were, working to build a place for spiritual learning and growth, and yet they faced an utterly practical, mundane problem. There was no theological complexity here, no deep spiritual mystery to unravel. Just a young man, a borrowed tool, and the murky waters of an ancient river. Standing there on the bank, staring at the spot where the ripples were already beginning to fade, the young man faced a moment that would test not only his faith, but his understanding of God's character. Was this the kind of problem that merited divine attention? Did the God who controlled the fate of nations care about one lost axe head? The question hung in the air, like morning mist over the Jordan, waiting for an answer that would surprise everyone present and challenge their assumptions about the scope of God's concern for the details of human life. Elisha approached the distressed young man with the calm demeanour that had become characteristic of his ministry. Where others might have seen an unfortunate accident requiring practical solutions, perhaps organising a group effort to drag the river bottom or beginning calculations about replacement costs, the prophet saw something different entirely. He saw an opportunity for God to reveal his character in the midst of everyday trouble. "Where did it fall?" Elisha asked simply. There was no rebuke in his voice, no suggestion that the young man had been careless or irresponsible. Just a straightforward question seeking practical information. The prophet's tone carried neither judgment nor dismissal of the problem's seriousness. He understood the weight of borrowed responsibility and the genuine distress it caused when things went wrong. The young man pointed to the spot where the axe head had disappeared beneath the surface. By now, any ripples had long since faded, and the river flowed on as if nothing had happened. To everyone watching, it looked like any other section of the Jordan, muddy water flowing over an invisible bottom, carrying the same sediment and debris as every other part of the river. But Elisha saw it differently. In his spiritual vision, this wasn't just another spot in the river. It was a specific location where God could demonstrate his power and his care for individual needs. The prophet moved with purpose, scanning the riverbank until he found what he was looking for, a suitable piece of wood. What happened next would have seemed almost comical if it weren't so profound. Elisha cut a stick, nothing special, just an ordinary piece of wood from the riverside. He didn't select anything particularly impressive or perform any elaborate ritual over it. It was simply wood, the kind of material they had been working with all morning, as common and unremarkable as anything could be. Then, with the focused intent of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, Elisha threw the stick into the water at the exact spot the young man had indicated. To the observers, it must have seemed like an odd gesture, perhaps the first step in some complex retrieval process they didn't yet understand. But Elisha's action carried the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to cooperate with divine power in the most unexpected ways. What happened next violated every natural law the witnesses understood. The iron axe head, which should have been resting in the mud at the bottom of the river, began to rise. Not slowly, not gradually, but with the buoyant purpose of cork or wood designed to float. The heavy metal broke the surface of the water and bobbed there like a leaf, defying gravity, density, and everything they thought they knew about the natural world. The silence that followed was profound. Even the sounds of the river seemed muted as the group of prophets stared at the impossible sight before them. Iron doesn't float. Everyone knows that. It's one of those fundamental facts about the physical world that requires no explanation because it's so obviously true. Yet there it was, unmistakably iron, unmistakably floating, unmistakably real. Elisha's voice broke through their amazement with practical direction. Pick it up. There was no grand speech about the miracle they had just witnessed, no theological explanation of what had occurred, no demand for praise or recognition, just simple, practical instruction to complete the restoration. The young man reached out, his hand probably trembling with a mixture of relief and awe, and lifted the iron axe head from the water. It was solid, real, unchanged, except for its brief defiance of natural law. The crisis was over. The debt was avoided. The trust was preserved. The borrowed tool was restored to its owner's care. But something much more significant than problem-solving had just occurred. In those few moments beside the Jordan River, God had revealed something crucial about his character and his relationship with his people. This wasn't a miracle performed for crowds or kings. There were no political implications, no national consequences, no strategic advantages gained. This was simply God caring about one young man's distress over a borrowed tool. The miracle spoke to the heart of divine character, a God who notices when sparrows fall, who knows the number of hairs on each head, who cares about the details that seem insignificant to everyone else. The floating axe head declared that no genuine need is too small for divine attention, no honest trouble too mundane for miraculous intervention. As the young man hefted the restored tool, feeling its familiar weight and balance, the entire community of prophets had received a lesson they would never forget. They had come to the Jordan to cut timber for a building project. They were leaving with something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of the God they served and his intimate involvement in the practical details of their lives. The miracle of the floating axe head resonates through the centuries precisely because it speaks to truths that transcend its humble circumstances. In a world where we often compartmentalize the spiritual and the practical, this story demolishes the artificial barriers we create between sacred and secular concerns. The most striking aspect of this miracle is its ordinariness. God's intervention came not in response to a national crisis or a life-threatening emergency, but to solve an everyday problem that millions of people might face. The young prophet wasn't dying, wasn't facing persecution for his faith, wasn't even engaged in what we might consider particularly spiritual work. He was simply trying to help build a dormitory and had encountered the kind of mishap that makes any honest person's heart sink. This reveals something profound about God's character, his care for the complete range of human experience, not just the dramatic or spiritually significant moments. The God who controls the destiny of nations also notices when his children face embarrassment, financial stress, or the weight of broken trust. There's no problem too small, no concern too mundane, no worry too insignificant to merit his attention. The symbolism of Elisha's intervention method is equally meaningful. The prophet used a stick, one of the most common humble materials imaginable. He didn't employ exotic implements, rare metals, or elaborate ceremonies. Just wood thrown into water, the kind of action that in any other context would seem pointless or even foolish. This speaks to God's pattern of working through humble means to accomplish extraordinary purposes. Throughout Scripture, God consistently chooses the simple to confound the wise, the weak to overcome the strong, the ordinary to achieve the extraordinary. Moses had a staff, David had a sling, Gideon had clay pots and torches, and Elisha had a stick. The message is clear. God's power isn't dependent on impressive tools or elaborate methods. His strength is made perfect in weakness, his glory revealed through the most unlikely instruments. The miracle also serves as a powerful picture of restoration. What was lost was recovered. What seemed gone forever was returned. What threatened to bring shame and financial burden was transformed into a testimony of God's faithful care. This speaks to one of humanity's deepest needs, the longing for redemption, for second chances, for the restoration of what has been damaged or lost. In the broader context of human experience, we all have borrowed things that we've lost or damaged. Trust, opportunities, relationships, innocence, time. We all face moments when we stare at the metaphorical muddy water where something precious has disappeared, feeling the weight of responsibility we can't fulfill. The floating axe head whispers hope into those moments, suggesting that restoration is possible, that what seems irretrievably lost can be recovered. The response required of the young man is also significant. When the miracle occurred, he still had to reach out and take the floating iron. God provided the supernatural intervention, but human cooperation was still necessary. The axe head floated, but it didn't jump back onto the handle by itself. This reflects the general pattern of divine human cooperation throughout Scripture. God provides what only He can provide, but humans must still act in faith to appropriate His provision. Faith in action is another crucial theme woven through this narrative. The young man's cry for help wasn't a formal prayer with proper theological language. It was a raw expression of distress that nevertheless carried implicit faith that his predicament mattered to God and to God's representative, Elisha. His willingness to point out exactly where the axe head fell demonstrated trust that something could be done, even when the situation looked hopeless. Elisha's calm confidence throughout the episode reveals the prophet's deep understanding of God's character and ways. He didn't hesitate, didn't doubt, didn't suggest alternative solutions. He simply asked where the iron fell, and then acted with the assurance of someone who knew he served a God of intimate concern and unlimited power. The miracle also highlights the value of community and leadership. The young man wasn't facing his crisis alone. He was surrounded by fellow believers and guided by a seasoned prophet. Sometimes God's miraculous provision comes through the community of faith, through leaders who see possibilities where others see only problems, through the collective faith of those who believe God cares about every aspect of our lives. Perhaps most importantly, the floating axe head demonstrates that God's miracles often meet practical needs rather than serving merely as spectacular displays of power. This wasn't a miracle performed to convince skeptics or to showcase divine ability. It was a miracle of compassion, addressing a real need in the life of a faithful but distressed young man. It suggests that many of God's interventions in our lives might be similarly practical and personal rather than dramatic and public. The miracle of the floating axe head speaks across the millennia with surprising relevance to our contemporary struggles and concerns. In our age of complex problems and global crises, this ancient story reminds us that faith begins with trusting God in the small things, the everyday challenges that rarely make headlines but profoundly impact our daily lives. The first and perhaps most important lesson concerns the scope of prayer and divine concern. How many times do we hesitate to bring our smaller problems to God because they seem insignificant compared to global suffering or major life crises? The floating axe head shatters this false hierarchy of divine attention. If God cares enough to make iron float for a borrowed tool, then no legitimate concern is too small for prayer. This doesn't trivialize prayer or reduce it to a cosmic vending machine for convenience. Rather, it reveals the intimate nature of our relationship with the divine. Just as loving parents care about both the major milestones and the minor disappointments in their children's lives, our Heavenly Father is interested in the full spectrum of our human experience. Financial stress, damaged relationships, professional setbacks, personal failures, all of these matter to God because they matter to us. The principle of integrity and accountability that runs through this story remains powerfully relevant in our modern context. The young prophet's distress wasn't primarily about losing money, it was about failing to fulfill his responsibility to someone who had trusted him. In a culture where personal accountability is often diminished and broken commitments are easily rationalized away, the ancient prophet's anguish over a borrowed tool offers a compelling counterexample. When we borrow, we incur genuine responsibility. When we make commitments, we create legitimate expectations in others. When we fail to fulfill these obligations, we damage more than our own interests. We harm relationships, erode trust, and diminish the social fabric that holds communities together. The young prophet understood this instinctively, which is why his cry for help carried such genuine distress. The story also demonstrates how God's miracles often meet practical needs rather than serving merely as spectacular demonstrations of power. In our entertainment-driven culture, we sometimes expect divine intervention to be dramatic, public, and unmistakably supernatural. But many of God's most meaningful interventions in our lives might be much quieter and more practical. The unexpected job opportunity that comes just when finances are stretched thin, the chance encounter that provides exactly the encouragement we needed, the solution that appears to an intractable problem. These interventions might not violate physical laws as dramatically as floating iron, but they reveal the same divine character, a God who cares about our practical needs and works in our circumstances to provide for them. Learning to recognize and appreciate these quieter miracles can transform our perspective on God's activity in our lives. The method of the miracle, using a simple stick to accomplish the impossible, continues to speak to God's pattern of working through humble means. In our technology-obsessed age, we often assume that bigger problems require more sophisticated solutions. The floating axe head reminds us that God's power isn't constrained by the impressiveness of our tools or the complexity of our methods. This has profound implications for how we approach problems, both personal and social. Sometimes the most effective solutions are the simplest ones. Sometimes the most powerful interventions come through the most ordinary means. The stick that Elisha threw into the Jordan wasn't impressive, but it was available, and God used it to accomplish the impossible. The story encourages us to bring our authentic selves and genuine problems to God without feeling the need to dress them up in spiritual language or make them sound more significant than they are. The young prophet's cry, "Alas, my master," it was borrowed, contained no theological sophistication, no proper prayer format, no spiritual jargon. It was simply an honest expression of distress from someone who believed his problem mattered to God and to God's representative. In our prayer lives, we sometimes feel pressure to make our requests sound sufficiently spiritual or theologically correct. The floating axe head suggests that God values authenticity over eloquence, genuine need over religious rhetoric. He understands our distress even when we can't articulate it perfectly, and he responds to the heart behind our words, rather than their theological precision. The communal aspect of the miracle also offers important insights for contemporary faith communities. The young prophet wasn't facing his crisis in isolation. He was surrounded by fellow believers and guided by experienced leadership. When problems arise, the community of faith should be a place where burdens are shared, wisdom is offered, and faith is strengthened through mutual support. Too often, we try to handle our difficulties alone, either from pride, embarrassment, or a mistaken belief that faith means never needing help. The sons of the prophets model a different approach, a community where needs could be expressed, help could be sought, and miracles could be witnessed together. This kind of authentic community creates an environment where God's provision can be both sought and celebrated corporately. Finally, the story reminds us that faith often requires us to act even when we don't understand the mechanism of God's provision. The young man still had to reach out and pick up the floating iron. He couldn't fully comprehend how iron could float, but he could respond to the miracle by accepting what God had provided. In our lives, we frequently face situations where we must act on faith without complete understanding of how God will work out the details. The floating axe head encourages us to focus on obedience and trust rather than demanding comprehensive explanations before we're willing to move forward. Sometimes the miracle becomes visible only as we step out in faith to receive what God has already provided. As we close this exploration of one of Scripture's most overlooked miracles, it's worth reflecting on why such a seemingly small event earned its place in the biblical narrative. In a book filled with the dramatic interventions of an almighty God, seas parting, walls falling, armies defeated, why does the story of one floating piece of iron deserve 6 verses in 2 Kings? The answer lies in what this miracle reveals about the God we serve and his relationship with his people. While the parting of the Red Sea demonstrated God's power to save nations, and the fall of Jericho showed his ability to conquer enemies, the floating axe head reveals something equally important but more intimate. his attention to individual needs and personal crises. This forgotten miracle has been overlooked precisely because it's so humble, so ordinary in its context, so focused on solving a simple human problem rather than achieving strategic objectives or demonstrating spectacular power. But perhaps that's exactly why it's so important. It serves as a counterbalance to our tendency to assume that God is only interested in the big things, the major decisions, the life-changing moments, the dramatic interventions that make compelling stories. The young prophet facing his borrowed axe head crisis represents all of us in those moments when we feel overwhelmed by problems that might seem insignificant to others but loom large in our personal experience. The financial burden we can't meet, the relationship we've damaged, the commitment we can't fulfill, the mistake that threatens to bring consequences we can't bear, the responsibility we've failed to handle properly. In these moments, the floating axe head whispers a profound truth. God sees, God cares, and God acts. Not always in the ways we expect, not always with the timing we prefer, not always through the means we would choose, but always with the same loving attention to our genuine needs and distress. The miracle also stands as a testament to the power of authentic community and spiritual leadership. Elisha didn't dismiss the young man's problem as trivial or suggest that he simply accept the consequences and learn from his mistake. Instead, the prophet engaged with the crisis as if it mattered deeply, which to the person experiencing it certainly did. This models the kind of leadership and community that makes faith communities truly supportive rather than merely social. When someone faces a crisis, even one that might seem small from the outside, the appropriate response is compassionate engagement, not dismissive advice or spiritual platitudes that minimize the real impact of the problem. The stick that Elisha threw into the Jordan has become across the centuries a symbol of God's willingness to work through the most ordinary means to accomplish extraordinary purposes. It reminds us that miracles don't always require impressive staging or elaborate preparation. Sometimes they happen through simple acts of faith, using whatever materials are at hand, in response to genuine need expressed with authentic desperation. As we navigate our own challenges, financial pressures, damaged relationships, professional setbacks, personal failures, the floating axe head offers both comfort and challenge. Comfort in knowing that our problems, however humble they might seem, matter to God. Challenge in trusting Him to work in ways we might not expect or understand, using means we might not have chosen, through community we might not have anticipated. The young prophet left the Jordan River that day with more than a recovered tool. He carried with him a testimony of God's intimate care, a story that would strengthen his faith through future challenges, and a deeper understanding of the God he served. His fellow students witnessed not just a miracle, but a revelation of divine character that would shape their own ministries and their own relationship with the Almighty. Perhaps most importantly, the floating axe head reminds us to pay attention to God's activity in the ordinary moments of our lives. If we're only looking for dramatic interventions and spectacular displays of power, we might miss the quieter miracles happening all around us, the practical provisions, the timely encouragements, the unexpected solutions to everyday problems. The iron that floated in the Jordan River that day has long since returned to dust, but the truth it demonstrated remains as solid as ever. God's care extends to every aspect of human experience. No genuine need is too small for His attention, and no problem is too ordinary for His miraculous intervention. In a world that often feels divided between the spiritual and the practical, the sacred and the secular, the significant and the trivial, the floating axe head bridges all these false divisions. It declares that the God who spoke the universe into existence also cares when his children lose borrowed tools, face financial embarrassment, or struggle with the weight of unfulfilled responsibility. If God can make iron float, what's truly impossible? The question echoes across the centuries, challenging our assumptions about divine limitation and inviting us to bring our authentic needs, however humble they might seem, to the one who specializes in doing the impossible through the most ordinary means. The miracle you've never heard of might just be the one you need most to hear. Hello, dear friend, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, how has your day been? Whether you're listening to this in the quiet hours of evening, perhaps as the sun sets wherever you are in the world, or if it's late at night and you're ready to rest, I hope you'll find peace in the story we're about to share together. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in America, perhaps from a small town in England, or maybe from somewhere across the vast expanses of Australia or Canada? Wherever you are, whatever time zone cradles you tonight, you're welcome here. If this is your first time with Sacred Slumber, I invite you to subscribe so these stories can accompany you through many peaceful nights ahead. Now, let's settle in together and journey back to an ancient time, to a small town called Zarephath, where a miracle unfolded that would echo through the ages. The sun blazed mercilessly over the land of Israel, its rays beating down upon cracked earth and withered fields. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen from the brass-coloured sky. The rivers had dwindled to dusty beds, lined with sun-bleached stones, and the wells that once bubbled with fresh water now echoed hollow when a stone was dropped into their depths. This terrible drought was no accident of nature. It was the judgment of the Almighty God upon a nation that had turned away from him. King Ahab, weak and easily swayed, had married the pagan princess Jezebel, and together they had led Israel into the worship of false gods, Baal, the supposed god of rain and fertility, and Asherah, the goddess of the sea. Golden calves and wooden idols dotted the landscape, where altars to the true God once stood. Into this spiritual darkness had stepped a man unlike any other, Elijah the Tishbite, a prophet wrapped in rough camel's hair, his eyes blazing with the fire of divine purpose. He had confronted King Ahab with words that still rang in the air. As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word. For months after delivering this pronouncement, Elijah had hidden by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan River. There in that secret place, ravens, those dark messengers of the wilderness, brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, while he drank from the brook's clear waters. It was a time of solitude and communion with God, but even this sanctuary could not last forever. Day by day, Elijah watched the brook grow shallower. The musical babbling that had once lulled him to sleep grew quieter until it was barely a whisper. Soon only scattered puddles remained, then mere dampness in the sand, and finally nothing but a dry bed where life-giving water had once flowed. It was then, when human resources failed and earthly security vanished, that the word of the Lord came to Elijah again. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. Zarephath. The name meant a place of refining, and how fitting it would prove to be. This small Phoenician town, nestled along the Mediterranean coast north of Israel, was under Gentile rule, beyond the borders of the chosen people, in a land where Baal and Asherah were worshipped openly. Yet it was here, in this unlikely place, that God would work one of his most tender miracles. So Elijah gathered his simple possessions, his mantle, his staff, and the unwavering faith that had sustained him through these years of drought and hiding. The sun was high as he began his journey northward, his feet raising small clouds of dust from the parched earth. Behind him lay the dried brook and the memories of miraculous provision. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the promise of God's continued care. As he walked, Elijah might have pondered the strangeness of God's ways. Here was a Hebrew prophet, a man who had proclaimed judgment upon Israel for their worship of foreign gods, now being sent to a foreign land where those very gods were revered. Yet if the years had taught him anything, it was that the Lord's thoughts were higher than his thoughts, and the Lord's ways past finding out. The journey from the Jordan Valley to the coastal region of Zarephath would take several days. Elijah travelled through landscapes scarred by drought, abandoned villages where the wells had run dry, fields where the stubble of failed crops crunched beneath his sandals, and hillsides where olive trees stretched their gnarled branches skyward in silent supplication for rain that would not come. At night he slept under stars that seemed to burn with unusual intensity in the clear, dry air. The moon, when it appeared, cast sharp shadows on the lifeless landscape, and sometimes he could hear, in the distance, the mournful cry of jackals searching for water in the empty wadis. But even as the physical landscape spoke of judgment and desolation, Elijah's heart remained anchored in hope. The same God who had sent ravens to feed him, who had made water spring from rock for Moses, who had provided manna in the wilderness for the children of Israel, had promised that a widow in Zarephath would care for him. It seemed impossible, even absurd. What widow in this time of famine would have enough to share? Yet Elijah had learned that impossibility was often the very stage upon which God chose to display his glory. On the third day of his journey, the scent of the sea began to reach his nostrils, carried on breezes that offered little relief from the heat but spoke of his approaching destination. The landscape gradually changed from the brown hills of inland Palestine to the terraced slopes that descended toward the Mediterranean coast. In the distance, he could see the blue expanse of the Great Sea, its surface shimmering like hammered metal under the relentless sun. As he crested the final hill before Zarephath, Elijah paused to survey the town spread below him. It was modest in size, its flat-roofed houses clustered around a small marketplace, with narrow streets winding between them like tributaries of a dry river. The town's walls, though not as grand as those of the great cities, spoke of a community that had weathered many storms. Fishing boats lay pulled up on the beach, their nets spread out to dry, though in these days of little rain, even the sea seemed less generous with its bounty. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, a sign that even here, far from Israel, the effects of the drought were being felt. Fuel was precious, when every piece of wood might be needed for cooking what little food remained, and families were learning to make do with cold meals and carefully rationed provisions. As Elijah descended the hill toward the town gate, his stomach reminded him that it had been hours since his last meal. The ravens no longer came with their mysterious daily provision, and the bread in his travelling pouch was long since consumed. For the first time in months, the prophet experienced the gnawing uncertainty that had become the constant companion of countless families throughout the region. But even as hunger and weariness pressed upon him, Elijah's step remained steady. Somewhere in this foreign town was a widow whom God had prepared to be his instrument of provision. The prophet did not know her name, her face, or her circumstances. He knew only that the Lord had spoken, and that was enough. The sun was now approaching its zenith as Elijah neared the gates of Zarephath, his shadow a small dark pool at his feet. Soon, very soon, he would meet the woman through whom God intended to demonstrate that his care extends beyond all human boundaries, his provision beyond all human understanding, and his power beyond even the finality of death itself. The stage was set for a miracle that would begin with a simple request for water and a piece of bread, but would culminate in wonders that neither the prophet nor the widow could have imagined. In this place of refining, in this encounter between a Hebrew man of God and a Gentile woman of faith, the character of the Almighty would be revealed in ways both tender and magnificent. The gates of Zarephath stood open in the midday heat, their wooden beams weathered and worn by countless seasons of sun and storm. As Elijah approached, he could see that the usual bustle of a town entrance was notably absent. No merchants haggled over goods, no children played in the dust, no elders sat in the shade discussing the affairs of the day. The drought and its accompanying famine had drained the life from this place, leaving behind only the essential movements of survival. Elijah's throat was parched from his long journey, and his lips were cracked from the dry air. Each step sent small puffs of dust up from the hard-packed earth, and the prophet found himself scanning the area, hopefully for any sign of a well or fountain. His eyes, accustomed to the blazing light of the Palestinian sun, squinted as he tried to make out the details of his surroundings. It was then that he noticed her, just outside the town gates near a grove of scraggly olive trees that had somehow managed to survive the prolonged drought. A woman was bent over, methodically gathering fallen sticks and dead branches. Her movements were slow and deliberate, speaking not of laziness but of the careful conservation of energy that comes from prolonged hunger. Her clothing, once perhaps a deep blue or brown, had faded to the nondescript colour of dust and wear, patched in several places with fabric that didn't quite match. As Elijah drew closer, he could see that she was neither young nor old, but somewhere in that middle season of life, where a woman's beauty becomes less about the freshness of youth and more about the character etched in her features by joy and sorrow, hope and disappointment. Her dark hair, streaked with premature grey that spoke of hardship born before its time, was partially covered by a worn headscarf that had slipped back as she worked. There was something in her posture, a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion, that made Elijah's heart stir with compassion. This was a woman who had carried burdens, who had made hard choices, who had watched her resources dwindle day by day until she was reduced to gathering sticks in the heat of the day. The prophet paused for a moment, studying her face as she worked. In her features, he could read the story of the drought's impact on ordinary people. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes shadowed with the particular kind of worry that comes from watching a child grow thin. Yet there was also a quiet dignity about her, a refusal to surrender to despair, even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. "Excuse me," Elijah called softly, his voice rough from thirst and travel. The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the appearance of this stranger. His rough clothing, his weathered features, the staff in his hand that marked him as a traveller. From far away, in her gaze, Elijah could see the wariness that had become second nature to people in these hard times. Strangers might bring news, trade, or help, but they might also bring additional mouths to feed when food was already desperately scarce. "Please," Elijah continued, his manner gentle and respectful, "could you bring me a little water in a cup, that I may drink?" The request hung in the air between them. Water, in this time of drought, was precious beyond measure. Every drop had to be carried from wells that were increasingly distant and depleted. Yet something in the prophet's manner, perhaps the genuine need in his voice, or the courtesy with which he had made his request, caused the woman to hesitate rather than refuse outright. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his character in his features. What she saw there must have reassured her, for she slowly straightened, her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms. "I will bring you water," she said simply, her voice carrying the accent of this coastal region, but also a warmth that suggested a heart not yet hardened by suffering. As she turned toward the town, Elijah felt a stirring of gratitude. Here, in this foreign place, this Gentile woman was willing to share her precious water with a Hebrew stranger. It was a small act of kindness, but in a world grown harsh with want, small kindnesses took on the weight of great acts of mercy. But the Lord had sent him here for more than water, and Elijah knew that his true test and hers was yet to come. "Wait," he called gently, as she began to walk away, "and please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." The woman stopped as if struck. She turned back to him, and now her face bore an expression of such profound sadness that Elijah felt his heart constrict. The weariness he had noticed before was nothing compared to the look of desperate finality that now clouded her features. "As the Lord your God lives," she replied, and there was no anger in her voice, only a crushing weariness and the terrible honesty of someone who has nothing left to lose. "I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. See, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words fell between them like stones dropping into a deep well. This was not the casual refusal of someone unwilling to share, nor the calculated response of someone hoarding resources. This was the stark reality of a mother who had come to the end of all earthly hope, who had measured her remaining provisions with the careful precision of someone planning a final meal. Elijah felt the weight of her despair, but he also felt the stirring of something else, the peculiar lifting of spirit that came when he sensed the Lord was about to move in power. How often had he seen this pattern? The moment when human resources failed completely was precisely the moment when divine intervention began. "Do not fear," he said, and his voice carried a new authority, a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own understanding. The words were not merely a comfort, but a command, spoken with the certainty of someone who had learned to recognize the voice of the Almighty. The woman's eyes widened at the change in his tone. Something had shifted in this stranger's demeanour, as if he had suddenly remembered who he was and whom he served. "Go and do as you have said," Elijah continued, "but make me a small cake from it first and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son." The request seemed almost cruel in its audacity. Here was a woman who had just confessed that she and her child were preparing to eat their last meal before death, and this stranger was asking her to give him the first portion. By any human standard of fairness or compassion, the request was outrageous, but Elijah was not speaking from human wisdom now. He was speaking as one who had learned to see beyond the visible, to understand that sometimes the pathway to blessing required actions that seemed to defy common sense. "For thus says the Lord God of Israel," he proclaimed, and now his voice carried the full weight of prophetic authority. "The bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." The promise hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. On one side stood the widow's desperate reality, empty bins, empty jars, and the approaching spectre of death. On the other side stood the word of a God she barely knew, spoken through a stranger whose only credentials were the conviction in his voice and the authority with which he spoke. The woman stared at him, her mind undoubtedly racing. Everything in her experience told her that flour and oil, once consumed, were gone forever. Everything she had learned about the world spoke against the possibility of vessels that never emptied, of resources that renewed themselves. She had no reason to trust this foreigner, no evidence that his God was any more real or powerful than the gods her neighbours worshipped. Yet something in his eyes, something in the absolute certainty with which he had spoken, gave her pause. She had lived long enough to recognise truth when she heard it, even when that truth seemed to contradict everything she thought she knew about the world. The choice before her was stark and simple, yet it carried implications that reached far beyond the immediate moment. She could refuse, clinging to what little she had, and eat her final meal with her son in the privacy of her own home. Or she could trust stepping out in faith toward a promise that seemed too wonderful to believe, risking the immediate needs of her child on the word of a stranger's God. As she stood there in the dusty street of Zarephath, with her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms, and the prophet's words echoing in her mind, the widow found herself at one of those crossroads that define a life. Her next decision would determine not only whether she and her son lived or died, but whether they would become part of a story that would be told for generations to come. A story of faith rewarded, of divine provision, and of the God who sees beyond the boundaries that divide nations and peoples. The sun beat down upon them both as she weighed her choice, but in that moment of decision, neither the heat nor the hunger nor the desperate circumstances seemed to matter. All that mattered was whether she would choose to believe that the impossible might, just possibly, be true. The widow stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, though in reality it was perhaps only the span of a few heartbeats. In that suspended moment, the entire universe seemed to be waiting for her decision. The very air around them felt charged with possibility, as if creation itself was holding its breath to see whether faith would triumph over fear, whether hope would overcome the stark mathematics of survival. Elijah watched her face carefully, seeing the battle that raged within her soul. He had delivered the word of the Lord as he had been commanded, but now the choice was hers alone to make. The prophet knew from long experience that God's miracles often hinged not on human understanding, but on human obedience. Not on the ability to see how a promise might be fulfilled, but on the willingness to act as if it already had been. The woman's eyes moved from Elijah's face to the bundle of sticks in her arms, then toward the town gates where her small home awaited, where her son was undoubtedly waiting for her return, probably listening for the sound of her footsteps that would signal the beginning of their final meal together. She thought of his thin face, his two bright eyes that spoke of a child who had learned too young what it meant to be hungry, and her heart clenched with the fierce protectiveness of motherhood. Yet something else stirred within her as well, a memory perhaps of stories she had heard as a child about the God of the Hebrews, the one who was said to part seas and rain bread from heaven. Or perhaps it was simpler than that, nothing more than the recognition that she'd already lost everything that could be lost, and in that place of complete surrender there was a strange kind of freedom. "I will do as you have said," she whispered finally, her voice so quiet that Elijah had to lean forward to hear her words. The decision, once made, seemed to infuse her with new energy. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her grip on the bundle of sticks, and began walking toward the town gates with a purpose that had been absent from her movements before. Elijah followed at a respectful distance.